must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
This is Jeremy Rothkushel, and this is the AnteDote Live.
And this is Greg McCarran. And how you liking that face of masculinity there, Jeremy, on our screen there?
It's only so masculine because I was forced to eat my neighbor's butt.
Indeed. So anyway, as you see in there, that is the face of manhood right there. The face of masculinity. The face of what it means to be a macho, a real man in this world. Alex eat my neighbor's Jones. And the reason I thought this was a good screenshot, we're going to go back a few seconds here to where Alex Jones introduces the guest of the interview. We're going to be one of the two guests of the interview. We're going to be breaking down and analyzing here. That is, of course, Lee Stranahan, now formerly of Breitbart, formerly known as Steve Bannon's pit bull at Breitbart, and then most recently at Sputnik, Fault Lines Radio, now no longer there as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll go through some experiences over the last several months as it relates to Lee Stranahan and some attempts at interaction correspondence I've had with him. But right now, we're going to start by playing an interview from the Friday, June 12th edition of the Alex Jones Show, where Alex Jones interviews first half is just Lee Stranahan. Then the second half, he brings in you'll hear his description of Dr. Steve Pieczenik here.
I'm gonna get my Lee and parents, and I'm gonna get my skillet, and we're gonna get down to business.
Yes, let's do it. So we're gonna go back here a few seconds, and we're going to play Lee Stranahan and Dr. Steve Pieczenik on the Alex Jones Show, with next to the Robert E. Lee statue, by the way. All right.
Turn the whole country down. I'm like, 1 million black people got deported. Shut up! 1 million black people. Shut up! Planned Parenthood says it wants to kill black people. Shut up, racist! Hey, let's not kill black people. Shut up, Hitler! Lee Stranahan is going to break down Antifa, and Project Veritas has come out, with proof that they're working for Soros. Hell, it's in the federal filings, but I'm glad we have the Antifa guys mentioning all of this. But what are they planning? What's really going on? What's about to unfold? Lee Stranahan from Fault Lines Radio will be joining us on the other side than Dr. Steve Pieczenik, who used to be a janitor at the State Department. He cleaned things up.
That's a
Did he
joke.
clean out? Yeah.
That's a joke. He did clean things up there. That's what Alex said.
And did he clean up Aldo Moro's body? I don't know. Did Aldo Moro die in the Steve Pieczenik operation? Or as you pointed out, Greg, Rabin? What did you hear about the Rabin thing?
By the way, that's an interview. That's something else we should consider for a future live stream, is that Pieczenik, during an interview, I forget when the interview aired, it was probably right at either the end of last year or the beginning of this year, right around the early portion of 2020. Somewhere, by the way, in the same vicinity time frame wise as when Pieczenik claimed that Putin and Russia signed off on the Soleimani assassination. The only place I've actually heard that stated, which is interesting. But there's the clip what you're mentioning with regards to Itzhak Rabin is that Steve Pieczenik, during one of these long form interviews he does with Alex, where he basically comes on and brags about a lot of the operations he's been involved in over the years, said that he was doing psychiatric evaluations on then Prime Minister Itzhak Rabin, and it basically come to the conclusion that Rabin was unfit to stay in power. And this would have been not too long before Rabin's assassination, which took place, of course, on November 4th, 1995. So that reference to you saying, did he clean out Itzhak Rabin's body after the assassination, is in reference to Pieczenik coming out on an episode of the Alex Jones Show. In an interview we should probably play at some point, or analyze on here at some point, that he did psychiatric evaluations on Rabin and found Rabin, I guess on behalf of the State Department at some level, and found Rabin unfit to stay in power.
Yes, and we should go more into that whole time actually at some point in terms of like how crucial that era was in terms of the shift, right, to this, some of this multipolar shift related very much to Moscow's secret weapon, i.e. Ariel Sharon and the Russian mob, and then Netanyahu, the Arthur Finkelstein orbit, the Orban question, and all of that ties directly back to that moment in many ways. Because even if you go into Red Mafia, the book, a lot of it in the very back of it talks about how some of Robert Friedman's sources were coming out of aspects of disgruntled Israeli intelligence. It looks like that we're seeing the rise of the mafia state in Israel, really. And how there was beginning to be an investigation into that, I believe, during the Rabin administration, and then you have that assassination, and that really was the end of anything resembling a serious question of a peace process or an actual a legitimate move on the Israeli side towards something like, quote unquote, a two-state solution. I mean, later on under Clinton, you see certain things happening, but it's not from the Israeli side. It was already done, and there is that history of Clinton's perception of the Rabin assassination. It was very clear that he knew that was it was a major turning point, right? And then, of course, there's the cranking up towards the end of his administration of the entire amdocs in the White House phone system, the Monica Lewinsky operation, Mega Group. All of that stuff is sort of is in recognition of the rise of that very, very global mafia state.
All while the domestic arms via Council for National Policy, the vast right-wing conspiracy is Hillary Clinton. Maybe the one time she's ever truthful in her life, labeled the whole Lewinsky operation of the vast right-wing conspiracy, working on the domestic scale, basically in a lot of ways, working hand in glove with a lot of these very radical, extreme Zionist elements that are pushing for the policies that Clinton administration was kind of standing in the way of to a certain extent during that administration. And the Lewinsky thing, of course, being used as basically pressure to move Clinton both in the direction of being more open towards taking serious action against Iraq, as well as an Israeli, quote unquote, peace plan factor to the pressure of the whole Lewinsky scandal. Of course, the deep background with Matt Drudge and the breaking of that story. So, and real quick, going back to Pieczenik before we play this clip, is I think
and Greg, will you stay real close to your microphone?
Okay, yes, I apologize for that. Okay, I'm here. Great,
thank you.
And going back to Pieczenik for a minute before we get into this clip, going back to the whole case with Rabin, is that I've only heard this very little about this. Like, I don't know what kind of deep research could be found into the nature of Pieczenik doing psychiatric evaluations on Rabin and what the nature of that was. I don't know if there's anything written about it anywhere, but I think that just taking that claim from Pieczenik and then looking at what appears to be some of the deeper politics and deeper global geopolitical aspects of assassination of Rabin from an extreme radical Israeli perspective, as well as even from a global, red mafia, as you called it, operation, then I think you can make a continuum even between a possible role of someone like Steve Pieczenik and then long-term interests of the varying parties from both an Israeli perspective, but also from a Russian perspective, as well as elements of whatever U.S. Deep military State Department type of operations Pieczenik seems to have been involved in long term. So I brought that in there with the Rabin, as that's very interesting that Alex Jones would call him the janitor when it appears, was he involved in the process of cleaning up bodies, or what other kind of things was there? I don't know, maybe it was just a silly lame joke on Jones's behalf, but maybe it's one of those things you wonder, the little smirk afterwards, was there more to that than people would possibly understand without being in the know? So
oh, for sure. I think that's very perceptive that you picked up on that reference there. And it definitely, I mean, if you think about the janitor too, it's not only the guy who cleans up, has the cleaning agents, and that could be either physical or political, but also it's the guy who has the closet, right? Who keeps things in the closet. So
there you go. All right, so let's get back into this, and we will stop and provide commentary at various points in this interview. So let's get into it. First, it's going to be Lee Stranahan for a while, and then Steve Pieczenik's going to enter the picture, and it will be all three after about 20 minutes or so. So let's get into this.
Call them mechanics, or they call them cleaners? What do they call them? We're going to cover it all straight ahead, back in 60 seconds. Straight ahead. And look at Robert E. Lee in studio with us.
Interesting, considering Robert E. Lee's now at the center of a school naming controversy down in Louisiana, that the Robert E. Lee statue is standing there.
Or I thought it was in Georgia, actually.
Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I believe.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean that's not sort of like fault lines, divided states of America, cultural, division whistling at all.
Yes, and yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, but why doesn't he have a statue? He should have brought the knockdown statue of Albert Pike and set it up in the studio.
He should have. Yes, he should have. I was thinking about that when you mentioned. I just didn't say it, but I was thinking about that. Yeah, Albert Pike. Boy, that would be a cause for. Yeah, maybe we'll go back to that here pretty soon. But yeah,
cause b'nai brith celeb.
Yeah, the tearing down of the Albert Pike statue, which appeared to be for a while like the untouchable of the old statues, at least back in the 2017. When all the stuff was going on around Unite the Right and all that, it appeared that was the untouchable statue, but it came tumbling down. And even Donald Trump made reference to it during his Tulsa rally the other night. And
they after the police sort of came and checked on it, they put a noose around it, his neck, Pike's neck, and attached it to the tree to symbolize both historical and potentially ongoing lynching of African Americans. So.
Yeah, I have a feeling we might be revisiting that topic here pretty soon. The Albert Pike statue goes tumbling down.
Be big. It'd be juicy. Crank it up. All right, we are back live, broadcasting worldwide. And we are joined by Lee Stranahan. Really appreciate investigative journalist. He's worked for Breitbart. He's worked for the Huffington Post. He's worked for the Keebler Elves. Lee Stranahan on Twitter, Fault Lines Radio host.
And works for Russian state media.
They're really woke right now. Now, before we get into Antifa, do you want to denounce yourself now here right on air and tell us that you're sorry for who you are?
I am, Alex. I want to say that I take responsibility.
Is that a Masonic sign? What is that?
I don't know. That's something 1905. It looks like it says on the poster back there.
No. His crossed hand symbol.
It's possible. I mean, I don't know.
That's weird. I don't know.
It makes me think of Trump. It might be unrelated, but it makes me think of Trump constantly doing the pyramid sign with his hands.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything to that or not. I was noticing I was trying to figure out what that photo was in the background there.
Oh yeah.
Interesting observation. I don't know if it is or not.
Tried to support people of color, or if you switch those words around, colored people, which isn't as cool, but it's the same idea. But listen,
that's not racial whistling.
I'm supporting people of color, and yet I am in black and white. And I don't think that's as supportive as I could be. So anyway, Alex, how you doing? Nice to see you.
That's almost info.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It's it's also sort of a Scottish Rite Freemasonic. No, it's joking.
This is InfoWars' way of owning the snowflakes, though. Stuff like this, and then stuff like what happened in Tulsa on Saturday when InfoWars was emphasizing a clip of looked like a Latino American, Latino Trump supporter badgering a white counter protester about where his reparations are. So that's InfoWars' idea of woke politics and educating the snowflakes.
It's counter woke gang.
There you go.
See how easy it is to be ponderous and
to be woke. Black and white needs to be banned. All black and white film, because it's actually code word of segregation. Genius.
No, exactly right. You heard HBO. Did you hear this?
They got rid of Gone with the Wind. It's evil.
Yes, exactly right. It's amazing. 10 Academy Awards. We won't show it. It's weird.
First black woman to get an Academy Award. Just ban
it. Exactly right. It was not directed by a black lesbian filmmaker, so can't be very good. Anyway, nice to see you.
It's good to see you. Wow, let's
get into
a
counter game.
Being looked at. Who really runs them? What's their goal? What are they up to?
Well, let me tell you. So I moved to Washington, D.C. right after the inauguration.
Oh, that's interesting.
I was at the Women's March, and I had been covering Black Lives Matter protest for a couple of years when I was over at lead investigative reporter at Breitbart. And I had been at I was there at the Zimmerman.
That was back when he was Steve Bannon's pit bull. Steve Bannon unleashed his top investigative reporter, Lee Stranahan, like a pit bull onto Twin Falls, Idaho during the whole Chobani refugee scandal, which was very much cooked up and I think largely exaggerated by portions of the right-wing media, including InfoWars. So that was the capacity of Lee Stranahan's work at Breitbart in the lead up to the 2016 election, as he called himself the lead investigative reporter. Bannon referred to him personally as his pit bull, and basically unleashed Stranahan to really gin up a part of the larger operation that was really putting terrorism and bringing the war on terror back into the public eye in terms of a domestic terrorist element, combined with the refugee crisis and events such as San Bernardino and Orlando. Then there was this event in Idaho where basically there was an incident that took place in Idaho involving refugees, and it was turned into this major cause of how this is just it was played big time into the bigger narrative that was going on as far as the war on terror and Trump taking the hard line against terrorism, both on a global scale and on a domestic scale. So that was Stranahan's work as the pit bull for Steve Bannon at Breitbart in the lead up to the election.
I wonder, did Lee ever get to the bottom of the Orlando nightclub background of the alleged shooter? I sort of don't believe he did.
I have my doubts. There's a lot of hours of Stranahan on hosting Breitbart Radio and doing interviews on there from the lead up to the 2016 election that should really dig into.
Verdict, I was there at the
American Gladio is so heightened surrounding this Trump operation, both in the lead up, and we've gone back over that lead up a little bit, especially when we dealt with the combination of Lee Stranahan and Rick Wiles in that time frame leading up to the so-called election of 2016. And that you're right to frame that in the not only was there a ramp up of this sort of counterculture, counter gang cultural operations, but it was also the re-ramping up of the terror war at coming home. San Bernardino, like you talked about, that was really sort of like what really set the opening. Then and then also in France, right, and then Orlando, and the sort of the fusion of gay politics into the war on terror in relationship to Trump, sort of saying, embracing, the gay Republicans and all of that. He's the one who's going to protect the gay community from the evil Islamic radical terrorists. He would just say the word.
Yeah, right. And you're absolutely right. And by the way, you mentioned Rick Wiles of True News, who I think we might loop back to before we finish with this stream. We'll give a few thoughts on some of the recent commentary coming from there, but we'll hold that for a little later. But I guess last thing I'll say about Stranahan and the Breitbart Idaho thing is that regardless of what really did or did not happen in Twin Falls, Idaho, the fact that Steve Bannon, who was at the center of this such a center keystone player in the bigger operation as far as the 2016 election, both first through Ted Cruz, as Ted Cruz being the vehicle of the whole Mercer, Breitbart, Council for National Policy, Cambridge Analytica, very much tied in with hardliners in Israel, and it looks like more or less on a global perspective, global basis, was the fact that he would have his top investigative reporter go up there and make a huge fuss about the story and basically turn it into a story of how tying it in with refugees are being used to destroy our society and all this and that as a means for domestic terror means, and the Islamist aspect of that, playing that up really big time, is not done by someone as big of an operative as Steve Bannon through people like Lee Stranahan or other reporters at a place like Breitbart, without there being a coordinated agenda behind it. So
the Chicago Black Friday event, I'm just all over the place. Dozens of Black Lives Matter events, and these two organizations merge. And when I saw how big the Women's March was, 1 million people in the street, it was freaking crazy. I knew that it was on and that this was the place to be. So I moved from where I was living in South Dakota, came to D.C., and sure enough, this is what I've been predicting for about 5 years now. And in fact,
oh yeah, you've been writing extensively. They're trying to create a civil war. And when I've talked about it, he goes, Jones is insane. He says Antifa wants a civil war when they're buying full-page ads in the New York Times for 3 years calling for it.
Even if they want a civil war, they're not the only people fanning the flames of something like that, Alex and Lee.
No, that's exactly right. And I'll tell you, I was at the Antifa march, the Black Bloc March, at the inauguration, the day. Remember where they set fire to a Reverend Lance Walnew's car? Remember that? A limo. They set it on fire and everything. Well, I was there covering that protest.
Very interesting. Lance Walnew, I'll mention this real quick. Our friend John Brisson, we've read the documents, has covered Lance Walnew quite extensively. The whole Seven Mountains of Dominionism and the Dominionist elements, basically make America, for man to make America into God's image, rather. And that whole aspect, a very important part of the whole CNP Dominionist, Christian Zionist aspect of bigger operations going on. And Lee Stranahan, I believe on Fault Lines Radio, has mentioned Lance Walnew as a close friend and a mentor of his, and he's even spoken at an event that Lance Walnew puts on, a religious-based event. And anyway, for people who want more information on that whole aspect of things, check out our friend John Brisson's channel. We've read the documents.
All Black Bloc, all Antifa, and guess what they were saying? All these white dudes dressed like ninjas, guess what they were chanting as they walked down the street? Black Lives Matter. So these two movements have merged. And I was working on a documentary about 5 years ago about Black Lives Matter. But you remember what happened? It didn't really blow up at the RNC or the DNC. Well, right now what we're seeing, cities on fire across the country, all of that, this is exactly what I knew was coming. And sure enough, right before the election day, and sure enough, it's the same attorney, Benjamin Crump. He is one of the big villains here.
And you always lay out all the proof first. Just get to the prime approximation. Who's behind it? What's the end game plan?
Okay, so Benjamin Crump's one of the guys behind it. He's the lawyer. He's not a top guy, but he was the lawyer for the Trayvon Martin family, Michael Brown.
So he's the crossroads where he's a key junction point.
Exactly right. And what he does is he makes this a Democrat narrative. He always shifts it, always. And as soon as I saw he was involved in Ahmaud Arbery, he's involved in this George Floyd case. He represents the attorney, represents the family there. This guy is a complete fraud, and he always works with leftist groups. You got to understand, Alex, the leftist groups are being played by the Democrats. They kettle the real radicals into this.
And the conservative groups are being played by the elite Republicans.
The leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza, I've written about them for years. Their history, Patrisse Cullors, for instance, she was tutored by a guy named Eric Mann. He was part of the Weather Underground. There's a direct line between the 60s Marxist-Leninists, Black Panthers, Weather Underground, and Black Lives Matter. Direct line between them. Obviously, one of the big people behind this is a Hungarian-American immigrant whose name perhaps you've heard is George Soros. Very clearly, when I looked at that women's march, and I went down the list of groups, and you can find out who funds them. Literally every group I found, I stopped after about 20, but literally every single group was funded by Soros. Now, what they're doing here, Alex, and you know this, I think, is the same kind of color revolution that they did in Hungary, right? I mean, forgive me, that they did in Ukraine.
Oh, that's an
right?
interesting. Isn't that an interesting? That's an interesting slip, huh, Greg?
Yes, it is, and yes, it is, and I think the reason why that's an interesting slip, I mean, a couple reasons for that. I mean, obviously, maybe it was getting confused with the context of Soros being, Hungarian,
yeah.
But it's interesting when you think about the Hungary is a key epicenter for a lot of things that are going on a geopolitical scale. Things, for example, we've broken down where. Lee Stranahan, formerly working for Sputnik, Russian state media, and basically playing the role of cheerleader for all things Russia, all things Putin, and also while using his platform as a foreign-funded state media operative to come on American radio airwaves and say that Russia get paid to come on American airwaves and promote the idea that Russia's done no wrong and running cover for a very very big wide scale operation. But with Hungary, it's interesting when you consider Stranahan being at Sputnik, and we identified a while back Hungary as an epicenter of where like you almost see like a converging of interest related to Israel and interest related to Russia, in that Hungary, via Viktor Orban's government being an ally, it seems, of both Putin and Netanyahu, as this epicenter where the Israeli government sides with Viktor Orban over in condemning George Soros, and there's a major conflict between Jewish groups, European Jewish groups, and global Jewish groups, advocacy groups, and over Israel's backing of Hungary's clampdown on Soros. And of course, Soros is a very primary to the narrative of Russia, as far as like Putin and Russia being this heroic entity, is that Soros has been basically shut out of Russia in a lot of ways. And so it's interesting you'd mention Hungary, when Hungary is like an epicenter. Also going back to things we've discussed in the past, our show Finky and the Kids on Arthur Finkelstein. Of course, Arthur Finkelstein and George Birnbaum is largely where this very exaggerated Soros boogeyman really originates from, that you hear everywhere from InfoWars to Glenn Beck to Lee Stranahan on Russian state media. And so it's very interesting you mentioned Hungary in that regard, because Hungary is an epicenter, I think, of where a lot of converging interests come together regarding various foreign entities and a bigger operation going on that brings ostensibly entities with ostensibly diametrically opposed goals and missions together, I think, in a very coordinated way.
Yeah, and if you see it's interesting. Like the way that I see 11/9, the whole Trump propaganda operation, that's a color revolution of some sort, and especially if you think about it as not just sort of malign domestic characters, but very much run out of the highest levels of foreign governments, such as Israel, most prominently Israel and Russia. In many ways. And so then if there were an epicenter, and remember that all of this is cloaked, and this is part of what we've referenced before about this interview that Jason Goodman did with Alan Dershowitz, where the big controversy comes around the hot button topics of Epstein, Israel, and Dershowitz denying everything on that, and then this highly hot button controversial disagreement about Dershowitz telling Goodman that the state has the right to jab a needle in your arm. It's almost sort of reminiscent of the clip of Bill Gates talking about, we're just jamming needles of genetically modified materials in kids' arms. We hadn't really had that kind of moment around the question about forced vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations in an alleged response to things like COVID. Okay, so that was sort of got so much play on into Tucker, into InfoWars. But meanwhile, the framework of the conversation, as the framework of this conversation, is that Russiagate, the Trump Russia investigation, which was much more global, which is about actual global conspiracy, really, that there's nothing to it. And that's the undergirding for the whole thing. So remember that. So then if you then think about Hungary as very likely, and we've covered some of this, how that if there is a European headquarters for Israeli intelligence operations, it's the Netherlands. It's Amsterdam. It's very likely the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. Now, it's said that if there is a European headquarters of Russian intelligence, it's in Hungary. It's in Budapest, actually, right? And so what you see then, in terms of these actual serious players who obviously fit into the actual investigation into global conspiracy that has been titled Trump Russia or collusion and all of that, it's very much likely that the headquarters of this global color revolution, right? Because there's a certain aspect of that involves where there's these whole series of sort of quote unquote strongman leaders that are tied into this, and a whole operation of policy that goes into this that includes figures like Trump, Netanyahu, Putin, MBS, Al-Sisi, Orban, people like that, and not even just limited to them. So if you really drill down on it, it's very likely that the global headquarters, in terms of the actual, tactics, the deployment of the actual operation, both in terms of the intelligence, the sort of the moles and the politics and the interface, the covert interface of different governments and characters and the campaigns and all of that, combined with the question of the deployment of the information warfare operations that were going on, that we've covered a lot in relationship to not only the sort of GRU's involvement in Facebook and sort of false oppositions between pseudo Black Lives Matters and sort of more right patriot organizations, even organizing on the street protests that were completely organized out of Russian intelligence, in the heart of the United States. But all the way to also Cambridge Analytica, and to those more sort of refined, really psychometrically tuned disinformation operations that were part of the cultural warfare landscape of that color revolution. I think that all begins to converge very likely in a place like in Hungary. So I think it's just a very ironic and hypocritical, many ways, slip of the tongue by Lee while he's talking about sort of a hyped up color revolution. Maybe we can talk more about like what is the actual, because of course Stranahan is not, I wouldn't call him a disinformationist. He's much more of a propagandist under the guise of being a independent investigative journalist, or whatever his moniker was on Fault Lines Radio, on Sputnik Radio. So he includes a lot of actual, almost more than almost anybody else in that kind of very specific sort of Breitbarty InfoWars sphere. He actually includes a lot of actual facts that are truthful, which would include some of the background of some of the characters and the background of the Democrat Party aspects of the Trayvon Martin case and Benjamin Crump. And that is interesting, that the documentary made by Joel Gilbert about Trayvon Martin is also very much in line with the background of a Joel Gilbert, where he is a documentarian to some extent, like thinking about like his documentary on Dreams from My Real Father about Obama, trying to paint Obama as the child of Frank Marshall, of U.S. Communist Frank Marshall. And that brought in a lot of facts that could be verified, and then delivers a payload that's pretty false, almost obviously false at some level, especially in terms of what I know about the very hidden background of Obama, is that he's born in Kansas to an African-American father who was basically lynched and thrown in the Kansas River for dating a white woman in high school. Okay, so and that's something that basically no one will cover. But Joel Gilbert sort of delivers these payloads where there's some kind of factuality to it and truthfulness, and then repartisanizes it, basically, right? And that's exactly what they're talking about here, how the partisan warfare aspects of Soros, Black Lives Matter, and all of that, and meanwhile they're just replicating the analysis in many ways, in a similar way, in the way that Joel Gilbert sort of goes through a whole bunch of facts in his documentary about Trayvon Martin that are verifiable and are true and should be paid attention to, and then sort of makes it, the whole payload is all about then the evil Democrats are responsible for all of this.
Yeah, and Joel Gilbert, I don't know if he's still hosting InfoWars from time to time. Now, I know he was for a while, and very interesting what you brought up there with the Obama stuff, and the fact that obviously that was a major operation in terms of taking attention away, not just from even like the deeper stuff you talked about, but stuff that is kind of well known with the actual serious questions regarding Obama basically being a creation of aspects of American intelligence through his time as a young man in Indonesia with his mom and the Ford Foundation and the CIA stuff involving there, to going on to being a disciple student of Zbigniew Brzezinski's in college, to when he became a rising politician in Chicago with the basically the more liberal democratic establishment, pro-Israel Zionist elements via the Annenbergs and the Crown family. The Pritzkers really got there, became major influences over him. So that just completely whitewashes and turns that into just a complete stupid wild goose chase that it plays into every like propagandistic talking point for the bigger liberal conspiracy that we're seeing play out now that's trying to destroy Trump. And I'll add one more thing. Who was it who made his political name off of mainstreaming the birth certificate scandal and the borderline dreams from my real father type of information? It was Donald Trump.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no,
So anyway,
that's yeah. And it makes a lot of sense though that Joel Gilbert, who's basically a hardcore Zionist propagandist, would sort of somehow miss all of the stuff about the Chicago quote unquote liberal Zionist facilitation or taking into the to their network of a clear sort of CIA background family of the Obama's mom's family. They're CIA. It's very obvious. And then her role, like you said, in Indonesia, and then Obama passed on to Brzezinski. So there's a serious question then about like the actual deep state, quote unquote, background of Obama. And that includes the question of a birth certificate, and because a lot of that had to do with his grandparents then sort of moving him out to Hawaii, where because they're CIA affiliated, apparently the grandmother's involved, with the highest levels of certain administration in Hawaii and CIA banking, and can then have basically a CIA program, visitor from Kenya to be named as the father, right? And so all of that is in the background there. But of course, Gilbert turns it all into sort of replicating some false, wild out narrative that plays right into what you've titled, focused on as the Mecca Mecha. Obama is a covert sort of sleeper cell Muslim Brotherhood operative, rather than this other, deeper thing going on. And that again is popping up right now, even in relationship to alternative media. George Webb, I saw, is sort of like going directly after that. This is not the Black Lives Matter and the sort of whole Marxist thing that Stranahan is sort of analyzing. No, this goes back to the Muslim Brotherhood at some level, and that's what the Minnesota connection is the Muslim Brotherhood connection.
That's interesting, the conjunction in of terrorism with that. And we mentioned, of course, Minneapolis being an interesting epicenter for these events, with the combination of what appears to be very strong evidence of Israeli presence in Minnesota within the Minneapolis Police Department in terms of training, and other connections that I think we laid out in the show we did, the first show we did after the Floyd murder, and then also in Minneapolis being where you have the Somali and Muslim American Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And the reason I think that they're really zeroing in on Muslim Brotherhood right now would be the Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. So Minnesota being a very interesting epicenter, and you have the conjunction of this with terrorism now. And then even circling back to Alan Dershowitz, who you just mentioned, Alan Dershowitz, who the Jason Goodman interview, and Alan Dershowitz is very much pushing that Black Lives Matter is a threat because it's hostile to Israel. And that brings in an aspect of things like where there's even like Black Lives Matter, elements, even trying to connect it to Hamas. And once again, just a bigger conjunctioning and conjoining of these movements with international Islamic extremist terrorism. So it's a very interesting puzzle there. And I guess, Jeremy, since I guess let's maybe something we can get out of the way right now, because this interview is going to go on for a few more minutes, and then I think we should let it play. But real quick, since we're on the topic of Lee Stranahan talking about BLM and his documentary and his expose of it, we've been we've focused a little bit on some of the work Lee's doing here through both the very provocative very provocative talking points he was using at the end of his run on Sputnik with Garland Nixon. We'll zero back to that after we finish with these interviews. But right now, do you maybe want to take a couple minutes to talk about, or maybe describe maybe where the problems are with like whatever truthful commentary is coming out and being put out about like some of maybe the Marxist nature of some aspects of BLM, the founders, and what's going on with that, where the problems are in terms of like a lack of analysis of deep politics, which would also come into Lee Stranahan relying on another fanatical Zionist war propagandist, David Horowitz, as being like the voice and the authority on all things radical left and Black Lives Matter and Antifa. The problems with like where, lack of deep politics. I mean, you just want to maybe talk about that for a couple minutes before we really move on and let this video play?
Sure, that's an interesting part of this, I think, that's really being exposed a bunch right now with the sort of change of venue of Lee Stranahan and his focus. Now he's been sort of moved out of Fault Lines Radio, Sputnik Radio, and now he's sort of really focused on his daily broadcasts at populist TV, so-called populist TV. Really, I think it should be called reactionary TV. But putting that aside, it is interesting that you also caught. I just wanted to, it struck me the whole time that we really began to sort of pay attention and drill down on this Fault Lines Radio thing going on with Garland Nixon and Lee Stranahan. It became clear to me that it was basically it felt like a Hannity and Combs style operation for the sort of alternative media RT adjacent kind of set, and where it seemed like it was set up for sort of Lee Stranahan to be like the sort of front guy, and then for Garland Nixon to play like the sort of side man who pushes back a little bit. And of course, the whole thing is framed as fault lines, divided states of America. But then they're also sort of claiming to sort of be, on the same page together about that. The main thing is that that the left and right are highly compromised in the United States, basically, that both the Democrats and the Republicans are highly compromised. Sort of an obvious state of affairs in the United States.
Yeah, it's like taking an obvious truth and then just twisting it by, because our establishment's so corrupt that, you can't believe anything about any other foreign entities having any type of nefarious operations going on, because all our governments do is lie. So,
and so you caught Garland Nixon actually respond in a very interesting way to a caller who was pointing out something very specific about this realm. Will you talk about what that was? Because I don't remember the specifics.
Well, it was interesting, and this is what I meant by like possibly some more deeper politics aspects of like intelligence being involved in some of these operations over the years that someone like David Horowitz just wants to make to be, this is just the radical left, it's just how they are. But there was a caller who called in, we talked about a little bit, or I don't know if we talked about it on air here so much, but Garland Nixon was a former police officer. He's also, I believe he has been, if not currently, a member of the board of the ACLU. But you caught on to Garland Nixon mentioning that he specialized in investigating and tracking what are called lone wolves. And so there was a caller who called in a couple weeks ago, probably about a week or so before their partnership ultimately fell apart and they were pushed out at Sputnik, mentioning of something she had seen or heard about years before, where a scene of a drive-by shooting in Chicago, where a white hand was seen pointing out of a car window at the site of a drive-by shooting. It was never followed up on, never heard anything about it ever again, this caller. And then Garland Nixon, even before Lee Stranahan, Garland Nixon, who sets himself up like to be the combination voice of the former police officer who's calling for law enforcement accountability in the murders of unarmed African Americans, kind of the law and order voice, the former law enforcement voice of like reform, and in that regard, comes out, who specializes in lone wolves, comes out immediately and poo-poos this. Oh, I don't think that's based in reality in any way, shape, or form. And regardless of whether or not, like, what basis there may or may not be to that, it was so interesting to me that he just immediately just like struck it down, like there's nothing to it. And so I think that is a bigger conversation, part of a bigger conversation to be had about, intelligence operations and deeper elements to these types of conventional narratives we have in place, like things like urban crime, as well as the radical movement, so-called. So
Exactly. And so I think that's very telling, because first of all, of course, there's this background that Garland Nixon says that when he worked with, he was a police officer, or he actually then said that he was in charge of internal affairs. Right, that's where some serious stuff needs to be investigated and or covered up potentially. And he said that in while he was a police detective, he had been involved or introduced to the concept of the lone wolf, which is so interesting because that's the sort of basis for the cover-ups of actual deep state operations, right? Is the lone wolf. Like, even just thinking about like Orlando or San Bernardino and these kinds of things, there's so many, there's a whole pattern of facts that point to it being much bigger than some sort of lone or dual couple kind of extremists who just sort of pop off. And so it's very interesting that Garland Nixon was so insistent upon that. He's very familiar with the explanatory device of the lone wolf and looking into the threats of lone wolves, while then also saying that he had been in charge of internal affairs. And meanwhile, he's also apparently on the board of the ACLU, and then he's just sort of like the sort of sidekick basically to Lee Stranahan, who's a major denier of the actual deep politics and deep state facts and operations. And I would just point out that like where he has gone immediately after these first shows, immediately after being kicked out of Fault Lines Radio. And is this,
by the way, he's blaming George Soros for, according to the title of one of his new videos on his Periscope stream, which I have yet to watch.
But he makes it very clear that he has no beef with the Russian government or Sputnik Radio. They were one of his best employers ever, I think, or he said they're the best employers. And to me, it sounded like he was making an extra effort in the days after to like praise Putin and to praise the Russian state media and everything. So that's sort of interesting. But immediately what he does is he goes and interviews David Horowitz about Horowitz's background in relationship to on the ground experience with like the Black Panthers. I mean, Horowitz comes from a leftist Marxist communist family in the Bay Area, I think, and that's sort of like the
an extension of the kind of Poderitz, even Crystal style of what we know now as neocons, who moved from the left to the quote right because of a combination of the societal changes of the 60s, and even seeing things like a combination of civil rights and the anti-war movement as a threat to their interest as very Israeli, very Jewish Americans who are very passionate about Israel. So.
Right. There's this whole neocon, right? That's the whole background, right, of the neocons is basically these sort of Trotskyite so-called turncoats or something like that, or flippers or whatever, And so, people say, all right, a conservative is a liberal mugged by reality. That's like that's a saying, right? And there's a lot of that going on right now that people are pointing to. But it's also the case that neoconservatives are apparently Trotskyites who have been mugged by Zionism potentially, or have just been sort of further taken in by the Zionist cause at some level. But yeah, so this is sort of Horowitz's claim to fame, that he's the neoconservative, Republican political operative that has who knows the left because he was there, his family, and then so Stranahan has him on to talk about the Symbionese Liberation Army. That's the deep state aspects of that are fairly surface level. People sort of are well aware of those. Anyone who pays any attention to serious politics knows the background of MK Ultra in terms of, I think it was the Vacaville prison. The guy who started the Symbionese Liberation Army, Freeze, I think his name was. Whole obvious background of MK Ultra there. The whole thing is obviously a setup of, it's a counter gang of some sort. And then, so he deals with that or doesn't deal with any of that, just basically sort of like all these left icons are really bad people, and the Black Panthers were just really, really bad people.
By the way, Symbionese Liberation Army is Donald DeFreeze and also Patricia Soltysik. So,
okay, thank you for that. And so yeah, there's so much there to unpack that could be, if Stranahan were for real in terms of a deep investigative independent journalist, he would pose some of that background information to Horowitz, which would be very interesting to produce something for the record, but none of that.
And Jeremy, it's interesting when you were bringing up these questions on his Periscope feed. I believe after he had already blocked me from his Periscope feed, which I'll get into a little later. He told you, I think it was a post directed at you, make your own documentary. So.
Right. And so, we document stuff too. So we create our own media also. So, that's a sort of straw man argument, right? That Lee knows all about. That's one of the shows right before he was canned from Sputnik was all about the teaching people about logical fallacies, right? And he uses them with aplomb, as we noticed many times on calls that we made into the show. He will sort of reverse engineer a straw man attack, and he's very good at what he does because he's very studied in logical fallacies, and so he will not use the real blatant ones. He'll use much more nuanced versions of them. So, so basically trying to blunt somebody's criticism by saying, well, why don't you, create your own media, or create your own work, is basically is not an actual logical response. But meanwhile, it's also a false attack against us because, we do create our own media. And so that's one thing. So then he's been featuring his film that he's talking about the background of a Black Lives Matter, okay? And in so doing, he also then goes and interviews the one of the key SWAT guys from LAPD, right? So that's what brought up that reference that you made about the caller referencing to Garland Nixon about the allegation of, a white hand shooting someone in Chicago, and it being then sort of, part of the black on black crime.
Yes, Chicago, which is another very interesting place for something like that as well.
And Chicago, of course, was plays into this whole Minnesota axis that we unpacked in our show about the George Shaw killing, basically. George Floyd. Why did I? I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, the George Floyd incident and killing and murder, as it apparently looks like, that a lot of those networks go down into Chicago, okay? And remember what Chicago is too, right? It's Rahm Emanuel, sort of when he's out of the Obama administration, he's back to Chicago. He becomes mayor. Chicago also becomes the site of the a black site. You remember the sort of the emphasis on the war on terror, black sites that were being apparently run all around the world, but there was a black site in Chicago.
Rahm Emanuel's chief of police was a man by the name of Gary McCarthy, and Gary McCarthy, I believe, ended up losing his gig as chief of police over the controversy surrounding the killing of Laquan McDonald. But what was interesting about, and you look at this from a bigger continuum style operation, was that Gary McCarthy was hired by the then mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Cory Booker, to be the chief of police, and Joe Biden referred to McCarthy, or to Booker, in reference to Booker hiring him as Rudy Giuliani's guy during one of the Democratic debates. So that was And there's information to be had out there about McCarthy and his relationship with Giuliani over the years. But that was who Rahm Emanuel hired to oversee the Chicago PD during his time as mayor. So
That's a key one, and I'm glad you brought that up. And we should dig back into the McCarthy Giuliani network there in terms of quote unquote police reform at a later date. And then I guess finally, in returning to the question of like the missing actual deep political analysis of deep state operations and the facts of all of that, in terms of Stranahan. He then also interviews this LAPD SWAT guy who was there in the epicenter of the times around a lot of this kind of LAPD I've talked about before is at the epicenter in terms of these sort of more covert police intelligence units, and then how that was then, it's basically an extension at some level of certain very reactionary aspects of a U.S. covert intelligence. And then ultimately in the post 9/11 era, or in the run up to it, actually, it looks like in terms of the creation of fusion centers, it has an epicenter around L.A. But then you're also dealing, back to the plumber question about Pieczenik, the LAPD knows where the bodies are buried, at least these sort of core police intelligence units, the guys who helped sort of set up SWAT as a concept. I believe that's who Lee was interviewing for the background on Black Lives Matter. That you're dealing then with the people who know where the body was buried about Robert Kennedy and the apparent sort of Zionist mob-oriented hit against Kennedy, just directly west of downtown Los Angeles, in the Ambassador Hotel. The whole question there, we've covered that a few times, but just a reminder, you go look into the Shine family. You go into the background of the Crown family, the Aspen Institute, General Dynamics, and all of that, which is sort of right in the epicenter of a lot of those deep state operations in the 60s. And, the LAPD knows where a lot of those bodies are buried. But then you then get into the 90s and you're thinking about what we covered in terms of the quote unquote LA riots. And the book that we referred to there, Alex Constantine's book, Blood, Carnage, and the Agent Provocateur, The Truth About the Los Angeles Riots and the Secret War Against LA's Minorities, that also has these allegations that maybe Garland Nixon, the sort of internal affairs detective, ACLU board member, dissident, former Sputnik Radio voice, would just deny as, no, this was the job of a lone wolf. It makes the allegations that people saw in the communities where a lot of this stuff was going down. Remember, there was the racial tension between the African American community and the Korean American community in relationship to the LA quote unquote riots in 92, and people saw the exact same thing happen basically, and people identified it as a police intelligence unit that went by firing at Korean stores at the same time as African Americans in cars drove by, and it was then sort of used to help generate further violent conflict in many ways. Okay. So this is the MO of these kinds of moments. If you really want to deal with color revolutions, you have to be dealing not with just sort of like George Soros and, his foundation funded organizations. And really, when you think about things like Maidan, I believe that and I think they maybe even get into that a little bit later. So maybe we'll play it, and we'll have to return back to the factuality of Maidan, because a lot of it in these sort of alternative media spheres was blamed on George Soros groups. And what I've seen in my cursory investigation of the Maidan Ukraine color revolution style operations, it was not George Soros backing it, and it doesn't make sense if you're thinking about like snipers shooting at both sides, which was the crucial thing, both there and in Syria. By the way, a lot of these we sort of like there's a lot of analysis of that. If you look at a lot of these kind of violent long-term flare-ups and conflicts and what can be called color revolutions potentially, a lot of them are initiated with this obvious. I mean, if someone's shooting at both sides, there is obviously that's it's sort of a de facto agent provocateur. There's no question about it. The question is who did it and why, right? Yeah. But if you have someone shooting at both sides in a political confrontation or a moment like that, that's obviously a force that's of someone who's trying to generate the conflict itself, i.e. an agent provocateur. And so I would point out that that is really, if you want to understand this moment too, in terms of like, oh, where did all these pallets of bricks around the country come from? Was it George Soros's foundation bringing in the bricks? Maybe. I've seen no follow-up from Lee Stranahan or anybody else about the actual origins of the pallets of bricks. And interestingly, none of the detectives in any of these police departments have, I'm not aware of them coming out with any announcements about they tracked out the origins of these pallets of bricks, including over here in Kansas City, where they found a pallet of bricks. It just showed up out of nowhere, and no one knows where they came from. So
they're very interesting, and so that's the kind of stuff that's missing from these analysis of what you've zeroed in on with the whole Black Lives Matter, Lee Stranahan focus on it, and bringing in David Horowitz as an authoritarian on the topic. Obviously,
an authoritarian on the topic.
Yeah. The authority. I'm sorry, the authoritative source. The authoritative source. The authoritative, authoritarian, loving source. How about that? As far as like certain foreign governments that get propped up in the and certain domestic people who are known by a 5-letter word known as POTUS is in the U.S. or what they aspire to be. I mean, but anyway,
we should let this roll, right, Greg? But
we should. The authoritative source of, but I'll try to keep this brief. The authoritative source being David Horowitz on this, and the complete lack of any type of serious. It's all in the framing of this is just how the left operates, and it's George Soros doing this. They do this because it's the loony radical left who just is brainwashed into hating America and all this and that, and hating all the good things in the world. And that was the whole basis of like the fault lines conversations, which, if you listen to like the last few weeks of that show before Garland Nixon and Lee Stranahan were canned, is that it came down to Garland Nixon arguing that this is of course, they both agree that Ukraine was basically U.S. deep state, just working against Russia. I mean, they both agree on that. But Garland Nixon came on the side that, this is just a generic, this is a genuine grassroots uprising of the people who are fed up. And Lee Stranahan comes at it. No, this is just like Ukraine, and it's George Soros that's doing it. That's creating all of this chaos in Syria, just as he did in Ukraine. And so,
Greg, now you got to deal. Now you got to deal, though. I think with Roger Stone on Lee Stranahan too. I mean, because really, I think it's a follow up to the same strain in terms of where they went with it. Don't you think?
I do. I in the context of the obvious, and I agree with you that that's where like this is the kind of things that bring like the the left and right side of the Russian horseshoe, regardless of what you think of Black Lives Matter, regardless of what you think is the nature of domestic protest in the U.S. Are they artificial, or are they genuine grassroots uprising of the people? We can all come to the agreement that these poor persecuted, these people like Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort are all just poor persecuted victims of a nefarious, all powerful deep state that just wants to destroy good and noble Russia, who's just trying to Putin's trying to bring back prosperity to his people, and also trying to stand up against the global U.S. Western hegemon.
And what was so missing from the Roger Stone interview, like in a similar way, you could have a friendly interview with somebody, such as he could have done a friendly interview with Horowitz while bringing in some of the actual background of the Symbionese Liberation Army and the whole concept of counter gangs and the construction of counter gangs by intelligence units and all of that. In a similar way, Stranahan could have done a friendly interview that supported, Roger Stone and his plight facing prison, and whether it's fundraising, while also asking some hard questions about the actual deep facts that have recently come on the record, such as his arrest warrants that have come up, and that some of the material backing them is very interesting in relationship to Roger Stone's direct communications, not only with, like, of course he said he wasn't communicating with WikiLeaks and Assange, and he was, maybe it hasn't yet gotten to the bottom of it in terms of what he knew and when he knew it about the documents and the leaks and all of that. But what came out very clearly in the documents is that Stone was communicating with the highest levels of the Israeli government about questions about when it was time for the Israeli government entities to intervene directly in the election season, because Trump was going to lose if they didn't. And remember, I believe those documents point to a time period of June or something like that. And even in one of them, it's a message from Roger Stone that he's just been in Italy with the PM, meaning the prime minister, i.e. Netanyahu, and talked to him in Italy. And then there's got to be something that needs to be communicated, right? And there's also a high-level minister that can be identified from Israel that Stone was in conversation with. And then I would just remind folks that all then led up in the months after to this second Trump Tower meeting that followed up to the sort of Russian-centric infamous Trump Tower meeting, with the more Middle East-centric Trump Tower meeting that I believe was in August, that dealt with Joel Zamel and Psy Group and all of that background that's deeply in the mix. And then also people like Eric Prince and representatives of, like, George Nader, representatives of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that sort of brought home the apparent Middle East and Israeli-centric involvement in the 11/9/2016 election operation. And none of that was brought up, and that hasn't been tracked down about what actually happened with this Israeli contact of Stone's, because you can tell he knows it's iffy. He's on the edge of, like, open criminality at that point, and people will say, oh, well, that didn't go anywhere. Well, there's no proof that it didn't go anywhere. All we know is that there's some other investigations going on, and that the Israelis were involved in the election further on after that.
It's interesting that was mentioned during a call on Two Fault Lines, and probably about a month or so ago, maybe a little more than that, where a caller brought up, when the story broke, brought up the story of brought up two things. Brought up Michael Flynn and his the whole vetoing Kushner Flynn attempt to get Russia to veto the UN settlement resolution, or to override Obama administration's refusal to basically step in and condemn the UN for coming down against settlement building, but also brought up the news when it broke of Roger Stone's contact in Jerusalem. And I believe, if I recall correctly, Stranahan's response was basically to say that, Roger Stone's his own man and he's not working for anybody. So that was the way he kind of spun it. And so going back to that, that's a very crucial time period you mentioned here, because as we're going to get into, and maybe we'll save some of this for when we, and I think I'm going to go ahead in this video, maybe, and even go ahead to the part here in a few minutes when we're finished with this, go ahead to the point where Steve Pieczenik comes on. It becomes a three-way interview. But we're going to get into this more when the topic of Steve Bannon's brought into this conversation during the second half with Bolton and with Pieczenik, and Steve Pieczenik joining Stranahan, is that this was all during a very crucial period in the 2016 election, basically when the Paul Manafort operation, another person who Lee Stranahan runs cover for. Paul Manafort is being an innocent victim of the Ukrainian conspiracy against Russia, basically, that no, Paul Manafort hasn't really done anything that would actually make him worth investigating, like working through Lee Stranahan's former colleague at Breitbart, Ben Shapiro, to write articles that were very critical of the anti-Yanukovych sector in Ukraine, in conjunction with the Clinton State Department, throwing out accusations of anti-Semitism via Paul Manafort and a senior Israeli official feeding information basically to Ben Shapiro in the pages of Breitbart. But Manafort's just an innocent victim who's never done anything wrong and is being persecuted by the Ukrainian nationalists. But and people who want to see this, Roger Stone's interview on Periscope with on the populist.tv with Lee Stranahan. I will provide a link into the show notes section of this stream we're doing here. So for people who want to see that, where they run also make sure to really tell a sob story for Paul Manafort, in addition to the Roger Stone, I'm going to die penniless and broke and COVID-19 in prison because of this witch hunt against me. So, but the shifting of the Manafort operation to the takeover of the domestic Council for National Policy, very Zionist, Israeli-centric Breitbart operation with Steve Bannon coming in as the head of the campaign. And then you have that meeting at Trump Tower. So what you see really, the second meeting you mentioned with Joel Zammel and bringing in the Israeli and some of the more open UAE aspects of this operation, is that you see that not only is there a cover being ran for the, the Russia aspect of the operation, which is what you would expect out of Sputnik, but also at a deeper level, there's still a cover being run by people like Lee Stranahan, who is an insider who knows the ins and outs of Breitbart, understands, I think he knows a lot about the nature of the types of propaganda operations that were going on in conjunction with Trump and also with Ted Cruz before that. There's still a covering going on under the guise of the Russian-centric critic of Zionism, critic of Israel, Lee Stranahan, for this operation that ties, Israel directly into the Trump 2016 operation, which was when this takeover, this campaign with Roger Stone and this Jerusalem contact. The Jerusalem contact was August 12th, 2016, which was in days of the Breitbart article that was ghostwritten by Lee Stranahan on behalf of Roger Stone regarding Guccifer 2 and Democrat DNC and who hacked the Democratic National Committee servers. And then all of this is going on right in this time period. And it's a little too convenient for me that Lee Stranahan just manages to still push that this was just a populist revolution to get Trump into office. And that's all it was when all of this was going on. And there's definitely more that he knows, and I'll get into this later. I wanted to ask him some questions about some of the stuff. I'll get into it later when I tell a little story about my attempts to dialogue with Stranahan, but clearly he knows more of what was going on, and he's still running cover for the Israeli aspects of this under the guise of being a Russian-centric critic of Israel and Zionism.
It's so true, and he also has never, of course, if you want to understand the controlled left, you can look into the Open Society and George Soros. But if you want to, understand the controlled right, you look into the, CNP and the background of certain key political dirty tricks gurus like Arthur Finkelstein, who I don't believe that Lee Stranahan has ever even mentioned his name, let alone told people about the background there and how basically everyone from Roger Stone to all the people who worked on Trump's campaign, John McLaughlin, the guy who went straight from working for Netanyahu in Israel as a quote unquote pollster, i.e.
and now is back in the fold for 2020 as well.
Yeah, it goes straight into working for the Trump campaign. That these are all, this is basically, you can see the mainlining of Trump, i.e. the 11/9 color revolution that we're still right in the midst of, ongoing, that the epicenter of that is the mainlining of the Trump color revolution into the Republican Party was done by the Arthur Finkelstein network. So if you haven't even mentioned that person, you're in no place to be discussing any kind of, independent journalism about the background of this moment.
I'm guessing it's for similar reasons that you'll never see a mention of the name Semyon Mogilevich or even the name Lev Levayev on Lee Stranahan's Twitter feed.
Or even the name of Mike Connell, who worked with Stranahan's didn't do nothing wrong buddy Paul Manafort in Ukraine. Obviously what he was, similar follow-up to what he did for Rove. In terms of, helping rig the election of 2004. And still no serious mention about the smart tech Republican servers, I believe, out of Tennessee that were key also. This is a Connell, first set up by Connell, I believe. And it was key to the whole operation. It was at the epicenter of the apparent election fraud part of the 2004 election. Remember, I believe that's the one where Rove is on TV basically saying, hold on, no, we know that what the exit polls are saying and all that, but hold on. And then, there's a whole background there that's been well documented. And meanwhile, that guy, Mike Connell, who then gets killed in a plane crash right before serious legal proceedings are beginning to take shape, also worked with Manafort in relationship to the Ukraine operation that was some kind of Russian intelligence operation of some sort too. And
yes,
these
and
are
also,
all the dictator lobbies guy too on top of that.
Yes, and in addition to that, a direct or maybe indirect Israeli connection to that would be, certainly from a propaganda perspective, would be the then Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, who was at the center of this, who was, among other things, a member of JINSA, the Jewish Institute now for National Security of America, formerly Affairs. So, all right, so I'm going to skip ahead here and go to the portion of this where Steve Pieczenik is brought in, and we'll play this part. We'll play this portion of the interview, and we'll analyze it as necessary. I'm going to skip ahead here to where Pieczenik enters the conversation. Now, do you want to add anything final before we play this? Keep playing?
No, go for it.
All right. Oh, okay, sorry about that. Okay.
To the church, and you've got the Secretary of Defense saying Trump's wrong about calling out the regular military. I mean, you're seeing a lot of signaling, and Biden saying we'll use the military to drag Trump out. This to me is what's left of the deep state, or the corrupt deep state.
Sorry, I got in the middle
signaling that Trump's weak. We can make a move on him. I mean, I see them trying to give confidence to a dying, corrupt, vestigial system that knows it's in trouble. But I don't want to underestimate how dangerous it is. Dr. Pieczenik, you can run psychological warfare operations, regime change, and a lot of big stuff.
Hold on, Greg. So they're talking right now about what I actually think is like the big sort of reveal of how corrupt Trump actually is, how anti-Christian he actually is, how anti-American he is, how we titled how seditious he is, and that's kind, really, was this moment when he had used Barr to basically use the Justice Department to create a police action on what was really, it was very much a peaceful assembly. A protest included pastors, from the area and around who were there. And then they clear the area, including with pepper spray and force being used against journalists, international press. And then that sort of clears the way for Trump to go. And the big part of this, of course, is that he was there walking with a uniformed Mark Milley, head of the joint what's it called, the joint
sorry, okay, I'm sorry
oh, the joint the head of the Pentagon.
I'm sorry, we're talking about Esper, Mark.
No, Mark Milley, like Mark Milley's
Milley
position.
is the head of the Joint Chief. Milley's the head of the
Joint Chiefs of Staff. All right, great, thank you. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, and sort of Milley's in uniform, and they're all walking across there, including with the head of the Pentagon, Esper, the Secretary of Defense, and then they're walking across to the church, and then Trump holds up an upside down Bible, and then people like Rick Wiles at True News say that this is his great Christian moment, and it's very obvious that this is, to me, I would be suspicious that it's not an inversion symbol of some sort, especially with Trump's so-called Christian background. He doesn't seem to really care about the Bible or its messages. He comes out of neurolinguistic programming, prosperity gospel, 33rd degree Mason. What's the guy's name again?
Norman Vincent Peale.
So that's Trump's so-called Christian background, and this was a seditious action, and the military backed away from him at that point, and it is a key moment in the exposure, not of the deep state trying to do a coup against Trump, but of Trump's apparent open sedition. That's all, and so that's what they're talking about here.
Yes, indeed, and we'll get back to True News and the way that was spun before we end this stream. But yeah, that's what they're doing here.
Many years ago, so he's here with us. Your approximation of what this Bolton move means.
Well, years ago, when I was on the show and I said to you, that's one of the biggest mistakes Trump has made, I haven't changed. I don't have to be a psychiatrist to tell you that.
Well,
John
you said
Bolton,
it. You almost made you break with Trump, and you said this could destroy him.
Well, I said it very clearly, and it did destroy him because Bolton is nothing more than a flaming sociopath whose background was totally concocted, made up. He was ruthless about lying and, self-aggrandizement. Two of my operatives, and they're two distinguished individuals. One was Carl Ford, National Intelligence Officer, correctly described Bolton as the following: somebody who kisses up and knocks down somebody. So he's constantly flattering the Trumps, constantly flattering the Bush Jr. administration. But you have to remember, Bolton is not unique. He is a stereotype. He's a stereotype of the chicken hawks or the neocons.
You mean like
who
Bone
talked
Spurs?
about war, never went to war, and on the other hand, were afraid to die. And here's where we have the problem. But Trump brought in a lot of people from the Bush administration. He should never have done that. And the problem is, of course, Trump has to rely on what was there or what had been there. And he didn't necessarily know the entire spectrum of potential candidates. But there is something there that is relevant, and that is that Trump had a certain vulnerability that Bolton knew how to manipulate. Now, let me make it clear. I'm not going to go into Trump's vulnerability as much as I'm going to go into the dynamics of a sociopath like that who gets appointed to political positions, irrespective of who the president is. There's always a vulnerability that a political appointment can manipulate, and in turn, the president manipulates the candidate. So you have a mutual kind of manipulation. In this particular case, Bolton knew a lot about Trump, and my suspicion is his sexual activities, which Bolton had been part of many, many years ago in New York. I'm not going to go into further detail.
Okay, that's very interesting. And first of all, the first thing I'll take away from what from Pieczenik's description of Bolton is that, sociopath, a liar. I mean, that seems to apply, a chicken hawk. All those things seem to apply to, I would say, to the president as well, but they never apply those standards to Trump. I mean, but and then also the fact that Pieczenik said that he was against Bolton at the time, which, I can believe that. But this was also, you got to remember, around the time of the Bolton nomination and appointment was when Roger Stone was on InfoWars talking about how this is a good thing, and Bolton was his, his old poker playing friend of 30 plus years. So, I mean, it wasn't unanimous at InfoWars. There was some aspects of the InfoWars pro-Trump operation that was approving of bringing Stone in. And Stone actually mentioned that on the Lee Stranahan interview that, well, I thought Bolton would work for the president, and it turned out he didn't, and I am kind of calling BS on that, to be honest. But anyway, go ahead.
And he said he likes Stone on Stranahan's show said that he likes Bolton. But see, what you're pointing to actually is what I think Pieczenik is actually referencing in terms of when we covered this, when Bolton was being brought in. There's this whole background of the quote unquote the Plato's Cave in New York City, right? And I think that is what also Stone is referencing in terms of he has this
Plato's Retreat.
Oh, Plato's Retreat. Thank you. Yeah, Plato's Cave is the actual philosophical concept. Okay, Plato's Retreat, right? And there's and this is interesting because I called into the Fault Line show to deal with Epstein in terms of the Carbine 911 scenario and how it spanned a lot of different interests, including Russia, Vexelberg, including Israel, Ehud Barak, Lital Leshem, who works with Eric Prince, and you can actually see her face in Eric Prince's interview with what's his name?
Mehdi Hassan.
Yes, at Oxford, I believe, at the Oxford Union, and he begins to drill down on the question of Prince's, the Frontier Services Group involvement in what is actually sort of now basically the biggest revelation from Bolton's book, which is a lot of self-aggrandizement, as Pieczenik is rightfully saying, about Bolton as a figure. But the big actual, one of the big factual revelations of it is this Trump agreeing or basically encouraging the concentration camps of Xi's in the Xinjiang province, basically, and that Eric Prince was being questioned by Mehdi Hassan about Frontier Services Group involvement in, I believe, in training surrounding those operations. And you see Lital Lashem, Israeli intelligence, in the audience, sort of, to me, looking like she's sort of on edge about whether her, to me, this is my perception of whether her asset, i.e. Eric Prince, can handle this public grilling. And so, so there's that aspect. And so I forgot where I got into that from.
You were bringing up your call into fault lines with Epstein. Regarding Epstein, I think I know where you were going to go with that. And it was going to be related to the whole, what Pieczenik brought up with Bolton and Roger Stone and Plato's Retreat and some things, and some of the things involving possible activities and people Trump was associated with.
Yes, and right. Remember that Stone has this deep relationship with Roy Cohn, and so I was bringing up, the possibility that this deep relationship in Manhattan, running around town to all these clubs, with the models on their arm, that the models were maybe potentially, what would be called beards for much more not womanizing behavior, but potentially sort of cloaked homosexual basically maybe even blackmail operations going on. We know that Cohn was involved in that deeply, both personally and as a political operative going way back. And so then I put that forward, and it seemed very, very uncomfortable to Lee to even consider that Trump may have been involved in those kinds of circles. But there are allegations about that, and so I think that is the unspoken piece, that Bolton was there at the Plato's Retreat in these circles. Allegations are that he had his wife basically gangbanged or something like that at some of these parties at Plato's Retreat or something like that. But I think it's something like what more of the Roy Cohn and the question about Leslie Wexner and Epstein being identified as the quote unquote boyfriend by the Inspector General of Ohio when he was investigating this mob relationship and this sort of deep state politics relationship of Leslie Wexner as the quote unquote patron of Epstein. So I think that is what Pieczenik is not even sort of barely articulating about what Bolton has on Trump.
And there's a chance that might be the most this has ever been expressed in an InfoWars platform. I don't know if it is. Like, maybe Pieczenik's alluded to this stuff in the past as well. And of course, it won't go any deeper than that, because they won't implicate Trump in anything that's possibly wrong. I mean, we're talking about the same operation where Alex Jones laughed off the video of Trump and Epstein together with NFL cheerleaders. Oh, it makes me like Trump even more. He's a man like me. He has 5 kids. What do you expect? But if it had been Bill Clinton, it would have been like, this is the worst thing ever. But anyway, I digress. But, and go back real quick. I want to make one more observation about Stranahan, is that Stranahan still, at least as of a few months ago, was running with the narrative of, Trump kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago because when he found out what was going on, which seems to come from, one person is the attorney, Bradley Edwards, who says Trump cooperated with authorities for whatever that's worth. But also it seems that claim may have come out of James Patterson's book, Filthy Rich. And of course, James Patterson being a friend of the Clintons, a member of Mar-a-Lago, who Maria Farmer via Whitney Webb has alleged was, along with Vicky Ward, was harassing Maria Farmer for years regarding Epstein-related revelations and things that Maria Farmer knew about that operation. So that's possibly a source for Lee Stranahan's assertion that Trump wasn't involved in anything with Epstein and therefore was actually trying to work against Epstein. So, and of course, there's a deep history we've gone into with Josh Reeves's work regarding aspects of the relationship with Dmitry Rybolovlev and bringing disputes over properties and money, which may have been the real reason for the whole Mar-a-Lago thing. But I wanted to bring that in.
It actually looks like that was and that Trump weaponized his knowledge, his intimate knowledge of Epstein after having run with him for decades, not just in Florida. And he knew, of course he knew who Epstein was. Look at that video like that you identified where that made Alex like Trump even more. Trump looks like some kind of like drugged up fiendy rat next to this sort of, a guy who he knew who Epstein was. He even made those public proclamations about Epstein likes his girls young as I do, and I mean all of that kind of stuff. That's sort of like, obviously that's hinting publicly about what he knows. And so it's very obvious to me that he weaponized his knowledge, his intimate knowledge, Mar-a-Lago, that's where Epstein was recruiting from, right? The underage girls to involve in his sex blackmail, compromise, trafficking operations on behalf of foreign governments, actually. And he was using that in order to basically take down Epstein in relationship to this real estate deal that you're talking about, which is where the big Russian connection to all of this comes in. Dmitry Rybolovlev, the fertilizer king. And people can go look into the background of that deal and research it a lot, because I think it's the hinge for understanding not only the Trump-Epstein breakup, so-called, but also the epicenter of Russian money and Russian influence directly in relationship to Trump going, back a good deal. And remember, Rybolovlev is the one who had his plane very strangely following the Trump campaign at specific moments, key moments in the 2016
And it was
campaign.
right around the time. Go ahead.
Abe, the previous owner, go look him up. Abe Gossman or Gosser or Abe Goss something was the previous owner. And just check out that background there too. Okay, so Trump is obviously weaponizing his actual knowledge of Epstein, not because he's a good guy or some kind of white knight or patriot, but because he was, as usual, sort of, using whatever he had to benefit himself, which was this payoff on that property. He basically more than doubled his money immediately on a mold-filled property that was then sold to the sort of biggest fertilizer king of Russia, who has been investigated for murder and all kinds of mob activities.
And what you mentioned there makes me think of another thing Lee Stranahan talks a lot about, which is Steve Bannon meeting with Jeffrey Epstein right before the election. And like this all seems to possibly be interconnected together. The Rybolovlev presence with the elements of like following the the Trump campaign and the newly elected or President Trump, and that aspect of things, that dynamic. And so I think that this really needs to seriously be investigated, inquired, and looked into. And I'll mention one more thing that I wanted to bring up. I wasn't sure when I was going to mention this, but we were listening recently to a live stream with hosted by John Melendez, Jay Leno's former sidekick, who now has a podcast, along with the very deep researcher into organized crime, Lincoln's Bible, and also a man by the name of Noel Kassler, who was involved with The Apprentice, and now he has a Twitter account where he really is very scathing in his criticism of Trump as somebody who has a inside scoop on a lot of the goings on at The Apprentice. Noel Kassler made a very interesting observation. If we're going to bring Russian aspects into aspects of the Epstein operation, possibly that have not really been investigated. And there's some information out there regarding bodyguards, and the names are escaping me. But
Zinoviev,
Igor Zinoviev. Yeah.
Igor Zinoviev, that's a key one, and people can go back to our show on that, where he's a Soviet special forces guy who then becomes mixed martial artist fighter, becomes Epstein's body man, both driver and security, for 5 years, and tied into other former Soviet special forces guys who runs these gyms in New York, also located in Israel, and also located in Moscow, I believe.
Yes, and what Noel Kassler pointed out was that in the weeks leading up to the weeks of the Epstein arrest and then subsequent death, suicide, whatever actually happened or didn't happen in jail,
maybe.
Mentioned that the only media he identified as being like stationed for weeks outside of Epstein's home was RT reporter, which is pretty interesting. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's anything significant, but that's an interesting little tidbit of information that would be interesting to get some possible follow up on for reasons and motivations for RT compared to other sources having such a stated long-term apparently presence outside of the Epstein home for weeks and months on end.
And didn't he also talk about this meeting of like where everyone convened in New York City, including Steve Wynn, who he basically
Yes. It was at the house of it was
at what's his name? Lutnick. It was
Howard Lutnick, yes.
And people need to go look at our show on Lutnick again, because that's the, thinking about geography. Well, Kassler is that his name? Kassler? No. Kassler?
Noel Kassler.
He was also talking about how the Russian embassy in New York, I think it's an embassy, or maybe it's not an embassy, but a consulate or something like that in New York City, that it's known as like the spy epicenter in many ways. And so he's talking about it geographically, where it is, that it's sort of, maybe a couple dozen blocks or less than, maybe like 15 blocks north of the Epstein mansion. But right next door, touching it, is this other brownstone, this Howard Lutnick bought brownstone. And so all these people convened in geographically, it looks like right next to Epstein's mansion in the run up to all this stuff in the last summer. And so that's interesting. And and Kassler's also the guy who worked on the Apprentice, and is the guy who basically said, Trump's addicted to Adderall. He snorts Adderall, and he basically has made him incontinent. And he's basically, he's hooked on drugs at some level. And then he also told some interesting stories about the Felix Sater, how in the audience of The Apprentice, sometimes it seemed like Felix Sater, there would be, the audience, the studio audience was populated with Russian mob types, and
the after parties were just basically filled with Russians, and I guess Felix Sater and Michael Cohen just bringing women for Trump's enjoyment and pleasure.
Well, thank you for bringing that aspect up too, Greg.
Oh, and real quick, last thing I'll mention is I've got a tweet pulled up here on my phone from August 2nd, 2019. This would have been about 3 or 4 days before Epstein, before it happened with Epstein. I believe we went up to Iowa that Saturday. I believe it might have been August 6th, and that was when the news had broken, and we
went up the day that it was announced that Epstein was dead. Yes.
Anyway, this tweet from August 2nd, 2019, from Noel Kassler. Trump was just at Howard Lutnick's East 71st Street house on May 16th for a fundraiser. They raised $5 million. Steve Wynn and Giuliani were there too. It's right next door to Epstein's, by the way. Wonder if Jeffrey was home. Here's another tweet. Lutnick had 40 people over for dinner on May 16th, next door to Jeffrey Epstein's place, which he bought from Epstein, by the way. Two of the attendants, Wynn and Trump, are known sexual deviants. Who are the other men besides Rudy that raised $5 million for Trump? Shakedown? ? At Real Donald Trump. So I'll provide links to those tweets and then to articles that detailed the Lutnick fundraiser for Trump's re-election campaign.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Nevertheless, Bolton had a career that was a disaster, both in the Reagan administration, the Bush senior administration. Personally, I found him to be a nice guy, but totally inept. And I found him to be a complete self-aggrandizer and a manipulator, which
I feel like there's concern about largely it seems very factual based observations that are kind of obvious about Trump's personality and some of the aspects of his personality, and some of the less charming, more damning aspects of his personality's lack of attention to detail and other things that really do not reflect well on Trump. And I think there's a concern about this, regardless of what you'll say about Bolton and his aggrandizing and the obvious shit propagandist he is in terms of war on terror and Israel and all that, is that there is a worry, and I think some of these people are trying to get in front of this narrative to just simply paint Bolton as just a disgruntled person who's trying to make up lies on the president, when I think a lot of the information actually does seem to be in base with reality based on other observations that have been made about Trump. So I feel like there is a sense of concern that they're trying to get ahead of here.
Mm-hmm.
which was obvious to me and to you, Alex. So when he gets brought into an administration, he basically destroys that part of the administration, or he comes in collusion. Even he had to deal with Colin Powell.
It's interesting he's mentioning destroying administrations because I heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio the other day in reference to John Bolton saying Bolton betrayed George W. Bush. That was interesting. I don't know what to make of that, but I thought it's interesting that you got Pieczenik talking about Bolton destroying administrations and Limbaugh. Somebody is like Limbaugh saying that Bolton betrayed Bush. So
remember like that on our show when Bolton was brought in, we dealt with some of the background of Bolton. He was basically he was acting like Flynn was at some level in relationship to the transition as a sort of broker of Israeli and Russian and Turkish, and multiple interests. That Bolton was going behind the back of elements of the George W. Bush administration,
particularly
including up
Condoleezza Rice, I believe.
Exactly, to hook up with this sort of hardcore sort of Likudnik cell in Israel that looks like a continuity of the question of how the Iraq War false intelligence was constructed via the Office of Special Plans, the Douglas Feith, Michael Malouf, Wormser operation, and there was additionally a cell in Israel. And there's if people go look at the show that we did about Bolton, there's a lot there about that background, and so maybe that could be what Pieczenik is actually referring to.
And it's probably at some level what even someone like Rush Limbaugh was referring to, but they'll never tell you they'll never give you like the details of like the nature of like what they're alluding to potentially with Bolton and what it would mean. So anyway, I don't think they would, at least.
Yeah. But fortunately, Richard Armitage, the deputy secretary.
There's another interesting name, Richard Armitage, that he's dropping.
Carl Ford and Richard Armitage are his guys that he's named as his guys inside, the quote unquote deep state apparatus.
Yes. It's kind of like another one of his guys would, I guess, be James Baker, right?
Secretary of State, who was very sharp and was in Vietnam and spoke Vietnamese, a brilliant operative who was at Annapolis, said, look, you're out of control, and if you continue, I'm going to make sure you get fired. Now, the guys who I rely on, like Carl Ford or Richard Armitage, they're in the system. They maintain the integrity of the system. But despite all that,
it reminds me of Tucker Carlson and Janine Pirro talking about how the integrity of the system is going to be destroyed if mail-in balloting is allowed.
Bolton's coming in repeatedly in one administration, another administration. Look, he's at Yale. Yale brought us Bush Jr. Yale brought us Cheney.
He's a sycophantic.
Yale brought us Mnuchin, who you praise, Pieczenik. He's going to praise Mnuchin, maybe not during this interview, but during another recent interview. And actually,
all skull and bones.
It might be during this interview where he contrasts Mnuchin to Steve Bannon. We'll see.
Wannabe blue blood fraud.
It is this one.
You got it. But you've got an institution there at Yale, which is a total sycophant.
No, you're right. Bolton is
Here they are using classic tropes about the deep state and the globalist and like the elite institutions as a means to just run cover for all things Trump, basically. Once again, they've been doing this for 5 years, but this is another classic example of that.
Like pus coming out of a wound. He's not the problem. He's just an extension of the disease.
Correct, Alice. It's an excellent way to explain it. And that disease is not stopping right now because we've had the Clintons, the Bushes, the Obama. Obama is a manifestation of the corruption that
Why don't these elites know how to try to at least work with the Renaissance and co-opt it to their own empowerment? From a sociopathic view, I could look at that and see that they attack Renaissance like it's the enemy. They're so stupid.
There's a problem, Alex. You and I, when we go into process or when we go on air, there's one thing that you and I have done that they have not, and that is you've created a show. You created a business. I created about 28 different businesses. I helped to create the Clancy franchise.
Very interesting, by the way, Tom Clancy. There might be a deep dive for him at some point in the future to understand.
I remember Clancy on TV on September 11th. It took me years to hear about other possibilities, but I remember that was the original fact that made me I had cognitive dissonance about why are they having a fiction writer on for September 11th on TV. I had no clue who Pieczenik was at that point or his role, or else things would have clicked a lot faster for me. So
it'd be interesting if Clancy was a long-term frontman for Pieczenik behind the scenes. Who knows? But
well, that's obviously what it was. He's basically saying that this is the real man behind the Clancy operation.
And I believe our friend John Brisson has linked Tom Clancy to the Council for National Policy. So that'll be something else to look into, possibly through some work that John Brisson has mentioned. The last thing I'll say about about Tom Clancy is that we went back to the shows we were doing about related to Robert Cadlick and the Dark Winter and the Committee on the Present Danger China and the whole biological warfare propaganda aspect of pre-September 11th, post-September 11th, leading into the current moment with China being blamed for this COVID, bioweapon, is that there was a chapter in one of Tom Clancy's video games based on Operation Dark Winter. So
interesting. And here, this is my single Tom Clancy book that I found used at a bookstore for 50 cents. Tom Clancy's Op Center. From the #1 best-selling phenomenon, Balance of Power, created by Tom Clancy and Steve Pieczenik. This is from 1998, and the description of it, I haven't read this, but Spain is a nation poised to suffer its worst internal strife in 1,000 years. Certain well-placed Spanish diplomats sense it. Op Center intelligence corroborates it. All the United States and Spain have to do is find a way to avert it. Before they can, an Op Center representative is assassinated in Madrid on her way to a top-secret diplomatic meeting. Now all fears are confirmed. Someone very powerful wants another Spanish Civil War, no matter what the cost. It's interesting.
Oh, yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, maybe Tom Clancy for another time. But just wanted to bring that up because Pieczenik will randomly name drop and just drop a bunch of information that will just randomly, that's just so interesting. Really
Clancy, he'll talk about like Putin, and he'll talk about that thing like Rabin, like you were talking about, Kissinger. He'll talk about like all kinds of, it is the case. It is stunning how little is talked about Pieczenik in relation. Pieczenik's the one who openly called the Trump operation a coup.
Yes, and Pieczenik was the most, from what I've seen, he was the person who was the most vocal, the most obvious in going out on InfoWars related airwaves and saying that no one died at Sandy Hook. Yet in all those depositions, his name was not mentioned once.
He didn't get sued.
Indeed.
So you and I are not dependent on the notion of the kindness of the stranger. In other words, we don't have to kowtow to somebody who
we're
we
not
don't
kowtowing
know.
to this rotting network.
That's correct. So what
we have our own rotten network, and it's refreshing.
It becomes part of the corporation signature. And the more you ban Alex Jones, the better he is and the more effective he is.
Interesting.
That's the reverse of what happens with a...
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying it's an interesting observation, and because that points out actually to the reverse psychology that was used specifically to support the sort of cultural color revolution around Trump in many ways, right? Because people had grown totally despondent and totally wary of the neocons, of the media. And so then basically what you have is you have these sort of pseudo surface level attacks from the media. We dealt with that ad infinitum. And then you also have that group of the neocons who publicly were, anyone but Trump movement, basically. But meanwhile, there was this whole other aspect there. And I would say that over time, you begin to recognize the way that reverse psychology, i.e., especially you can even see this in relationship to some type aspects of like the COVID period, where the idea of banning then is then sort of just for whole swaths, especially of like people with critical minds, that then just is proof, basically. You don't need to know anything else. Just proof that that person is over the target, or that that's the truth, or any of that kind of thing. So I would just point out that we're in the age where the mass MK Ultra, the mass consciousness operations, the con-ops that were run via things like Cambridge Analytica, that they've obviously factored in the power of quote unquote reverse psychology when they're dealing with the, quote unquote truth community, alt media, patriots, all of those sort of susceptible entities to reactionary epistemology, as I would call it.
Very true.
John Bolton. The John Bolton scurry off to the most obsolete units in the world. A publishing company. Are you kidding? Simon & Schuster's basically dead. Publishing is dead. I've been in publishing over 35 years, and I can guarantee you they're barely alive.
Sure, their instinct is to go to the most stagnant, dead thing. They run to graveyards.
Correct. But they're the product of graveyards. It's a good analogy, Alex. On this one hand, they come from the moss of death and what we consider vitality, the Yale University.
Notice Pieczenik's like the one person Alex doesn't constantly talk over.
That's a dead institution. The Cornells, the Harvards. You just had a professor from Harvard implicated and indicted for tax fraud. He's not the only one. He had labs in China. How many other professors? I can go through MIT and Harvard and Cornell and show you how many have been.
Unrelated, I think very soon we're going to be doing a long form broadcast around some of that stuff and some other people who might be implicated in some of this China, Ivy League, Epstein aspects of operations. I think we're going to be doing something on that here in the very near future. So stay tuned.
The names to look out for are, of course, Charles Lieber is who he's referring to. He didn't even name him, and it does look like that very recently that the Lieber was arrested very early on in like late January, I think it was, in relationship to this question that Pieczenik's talking about. Chinese intelligence, working with Chinese intelligence, basically, but it now looks that basically they've downscaled his grand jury indictment to basically a Michael Flynn sort of lying to federal officials. So we've seen how it works to basically cover up the deeper aspects very often. But so that's one name. You can go look into who his dad is, who his father was, Lieber's father, and his father worked for the guy who created RCA and NBC.
Westinghouse?
No,
Sarnoff.
David Sarnoff, right? And this idea, I've talked about it. There is an aspect, right? The question of like 5G, right? The Internet of Things, right? Just recently, big revelation of major by the Israelis, by an Israeli cybersecurity firm, of major compromise of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of Internet of Things devices, basically the chips in there, right? And so there is this aspect of the question of the rollout of this powerful invisible network that is being, I believe, totally disinformed and discredited via the way that the people like the David Ikes and stuff like that have used that information to talk about COVID, for example, and 5G. But meanwhile, if you go to the background here of people like Lieber himself, you're dealing with nanotech inside cells. You're dealing with wireless technology inside brains, implants. And he's interfacing with the highest levels of Chinese government. He's also involved in Israel, of course. It looks like he's involved with I forget which university. We'll try to roll through all of this when we actually do a full show on this. But look into some of that, and then another name that we'll be looking at is the figure of Michael Levitt, who was put forth as sort of like I think he was like seen as the first big Nobel Prize winner to basically say that COVID was mainly hype, that it wasn't dangerous, reopen now. And no one points out, no one, including like, the alt media types, who seem to embrace his message at some level in terms of the COVID skepticism. They then fail to then look into his background, which he's an Israeli national. He's also a South African national, and he's a UK and US national, a Stanford guy. and very much still involved in Israeli universities. And so, we're going to trace some of that background there that I think is highly relevant to this moment in terms of the relationship of South Africa and Israel, the question of ethno-specific bioweapons, and after apartheid South Africa was over, basically Israel not only incorporated, as we're well aware of, Soviet scientists, input of Chinese scientists into some of their biowarfare programs, obvious US, UK involvement, but they also incorporated the South African program, which did include attempts at ethno-specific bioweapons. The Israelis wanted to turn it into, of course, pointed at the Palestinians, at Arabs more generally in there. And then, of course, we also then have pointed out that the Israelis took over that South African program after the end of apartheid South Africa, but their background, of course, goes way back. They did a test together off the coast of South Africa, a nuclear test in the late 70s, South Africa and Israel together. So these these weapons of mass destruction, whether biological or nuclear, there's been this relationship there that will trace back. And so that, of course, is a lot of what's behind this sort of quick reference to some Harvard guy. And so instead of specifying it, Pieczenik basically just turns it into the entirety of this is just a rotting institution. That critique is largely true in terms of, it's the similarity of what he said about to maintain the integrity. My guys who are maintaining the integrity or whatever, was that the integrity of that the I and the FBI stood for, or what, but so I just pointing out that is similarly to what he talked about what Bolton might have on Trump, where there's this reference to this whole body of information. Yeah, he basically sort of generalizes that or covers it up so that people sort of just rush over it.
Involved in chicanery. So
we'll be revisiting that here, visiting that in a long form in the very near future. Not sure when, but it'll be coming soon. So
what we have on the alternative media, we're the reality testers, where they said, oh yeah, we believe in conspiracy. Fine. I don't care what you call me. I don't care what you call Alex. It's called reality testing. And the Boltons of the world, they'll scurry to the moribund systems.
So
just don't call me for a deposition for Sandy Hook victims.
Right.
Now, because, that time bomb of Bolton is there.
Let me say this, Alex, with all due respect to your analysis. I've never believed that Trump was in danger, and I'll tell you why. People have to understand one thing about Trump. He's not about words. He's not about process. He is about action. The minute he goes out to the United States, he's coming here to Gainesville, to Jacksonville. He's coming to a Republican area where there's going to be thousands of people.
Would that be somewhere in the vicinity of the
tip of the spear?
Tip of the spear? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. With a guy who Pieczenik very much is very fond of, is the governor of Florida, who very much is definitely in line with Israeli deep state aspects. It seems like would be Ron DeSantis, who Pieczenik's very fond of. So that's going to be interesting to watch and follow come the time of the Republican National Convention, that it's been moved down to Florida, and the whole aspect of things related to the counter coup that Pieczenik talked about in 2016 with Delta Force and.
Greg, it's interesting too. What just popped in my mind, because I didn't realize. Thank you for bringing that up. I didn't know that Pieczenik was fond of DeSantis.
He's praised him before, as one of the new branch of southern governors, politicians.
And because then that brings me back to the question of the way that these sort of controlled left right, Democrat Republican exposés are run in many ways, right? Because that's also a key. Andrew Gillum, the sort of now potentially disgraced Andrew Gillum, features as a key figure in the Joel Gilbert documentary about about Trayvon Martin, about the Trayvon, quote unquote, Trayvon Martin hoax. And so I think that's sort of interesting. So basically then, and it did, we delved into a little bit of this, but it looks like obviously neither one of these guys, whether it's Gillum or DeSantis, are clean politicians.
But the very Zionist heavy oriented right-wing media via people like Aaron Klein, the head of Breitbart Jerusalem, the American who went to Israel, now has Israeli citizenship, is now working in the Netanyahu government. We're very, 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 very adamant and very, very zeroed in on Andrew Gillum, portraying him as everything from like a black radical to a Palestinian sympathizer to anti-Israel Palestinian sympathizer. So very clearly, like Ron DeSantis, like that's. And it's interesting, is Ron DeSantis the Jeb Bush of the Trump administration? This Jeb Bush was the governor for his brother when some of the pre-9/11 stuff was going on down in Florida with flight training and things like that. And I'm not saying another 9/11 style incident is going to happen under the Trump administration, but with somebody like Ron DeSantis as governor, I mean, does he play a role of like a Jeb Bush in the Trump administration? I don't know, but it's something to maybe think about.
And we saw this crazy ad, full-page ad that was rolled out in some Tennessee newspaper that was saying that Islam is going to basically nuke Nashville or something on some specific date in July or something like that. So we're beginning to feel the inklings, perceive the inklings of what we saw in 2016, the rollout of the sort of re-rollout of the terror war threat. And so we do need to keep our eyes open to that.
Yes.
Don't care about the mythical COVID virus. From there, he will go to.
No, you're right. He's breaking the will of the fraud, and so you're right. He's about total action.
That's totally it. And he creates. It's not only action. It's just like what you do and what I do. He creates an entity. I can't emphasize it enough. I don't care what he says in the meantime.
He creates a focus for people to put our action into.
Exactly. And at the same time, he'll create a building, a hotel, a Doral, a casino. Who
money laundering operations? Yeah.
Who else has ever done that?
Money laundering fronts, like on a grand scale, like some of probably the biggest money laundering fronts known in like our
purposeful failure in order to be able to write off money laundering operations.
Goes bankrupt and then is told by still largely unidentified names via Wilbur Ross, Rothschild Inc. Bailout, bankruptcy head, more valuable to us alive than dead. I mean, that whole thing.
Yeah.
Oh, and a wall. I mean, who else has created?
The big banks just want money and power that's made up. Trump fundamentally is about service. He gets, if we aren't doing well, he's not doing well.
Correct. And his job right now is to serve the American public, and he loves it. That's the ultimate apex for him. You've got to remember, his uncle was a professor at MIT, never talks about that, a brilliant professor. His father was a brilliant businessman.
Yeah, brilliant businessman. He basically the money man for Roy Cohn and the Fat Tony Salerno crime family over in New York that basically gave the Trump family where they made their bones, basically.
The epicenter of like the Lansky Jewish mob and the
epicenter of the Jewish and Italian mafias. Yes, and of course, there's a history with them basically being replaced once the Soviet emigres come in, and the Italians took the fall so that the Eastern European Jewish-centric aspects of the global organized crime operation could take the kind of the full range of power.
And Chabad, it's even there's Chabad and KKK in the mix. It almost sounds like the whole sort of Civil War history of like the B'nai B'rith and the Albert Pikes and the
very interesting
Scottish, and KKK and all of that whole scenario. It feels like a very similar kind of nest.
That's what they won't tell you when, the Trump discrimination thing, that's known out there. But how well is it known that, Woody Guthrie, and this is before anybody knew about Trump or knew that there'd be a deep state conspiracy to destroy Fred Trump's son, like 7 or 8 decades later. How many people actually know that he made a song called Old Man Trump about Fred Trump basically being a Klansman and also being Woody Guthrie's landlord?
Jeez.
There are a lot of apartments and real estate from nothing. So you have a man here who's going to bring the United States back again.
This is where you can expose this as a completely phony operation. This type of stuff right here, sophisticated as of a war psychological operative as like Steve Pieczenik is, and as brilliant as he obviously is in a lot of ways, this is where you could see that there's just this is such an obviously fake operation in terms of being any type of serious truth telling when they push blatant BS like this.
And this was basically just pure, undeveloped, like Manhattan, Native American land that Trump just built out of nothing, and there was no infrastructure or nothing there, and meanwhile also there's also the background of his the dad side of the family. I think it's the dad side of the family in running the brothels in relationship to, I think, like Alaska and all of that. So that's some of the background, is these kind of like this. If you can think of like any operations that are at the epicenter of the actual deep state, i.e. the black economy, i.e. the mob economy, black economics side of the deep state, the intersection of the national security covert operations apparatus and the actual mobbed up economics, it's basically things like, casinos, prostitutes, right? And this is real estate that you can, and real estate, that's
especially
what everyone,
very high priced hotels and things of that nature.
Go look at the relation of look at Panama, Trump Toronto, Trump Azerbaijan, Trump Vancouver. But I mean, Trump Toronto is at the epicenter. You go look at the background of the people who put together Trump Toronto, and just go look how it fits in exactly with. And this is the other thing that we didn't mention from going back to the beginning, and of Pieczenik analyzing, doing a psychoanalysis of Rabin right before his assassination. That then in the immediate wake, or maybe even in the run up, or didn't we find out the timing of the run up to the Rabin assassination is the global Israeli gathering of the global mob with the sort of heavy, Russian Mogilevich connection. But a lot of those guys, Moshkovich, I think, is one of them. Go look at the background of Trump Toronto in relationship to the characters who convened the Israeli mob meeting in 1990. What was it, Greg? Was it? You looked it up. It was like 94,
in 1995.
95.
It was in the time period of, I would say, I can't remember the exact date, but it was definitely within a year of the assassination of Rabin preceding it.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. And this is
make it great.
I'll say this, the truth about Trump is like, we haven't even begun, I don't think, to scratch the surface of a lot of this stuff, but it's so much worse that you've got this operation where you're either not getting told enough of the information, you're getting a very limited scope of information regarding the depths of this operation, or you're just getting complete whitewashing in the name of truth-telling alternative media for all things related to Trump. But I get the impression more and more that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of just like how deep this operation goes.
Not believe he's in any danger.
All right, do a few more minutes with us, and we've got Lee Stranahan here who's going to pop in with you and get some final comments from Dr. Steve Pieczenik, stevepieczenik.com. We really appreciate him coming on short notice, talking about Bolton. And I think he overall is right, but we just cannot underestimate these globalists, I tell you. All right, Dr. Steve Pieczenik's here with us. Lee Stranahan's been riding shotgun, investigative journalist, host of Fault Lines Radio. Dr. Pieczenik.
Wait, I just want to point out,
I agree,
Alex never mentioned, he said he worked for the Keebler Elves in the beginning. He never mentions that Stranahan was working for Russian state media. He never even mentions the name Sputnik, right? So that is very interesting. That's a sensitive point, I think.
Possibly.
America's waking up. There's a global renaissance happening. China's on the verge of collapsing until this whole COVID hoax. And so I agree with you that I think Trump's still we're in a position to beat this.
Wait a minute. Is Alex saying that COVID saved China? I don't get it. Okay, never mind. Keep going.
It's interesting. Although I was going to bring up, if COVID's such a, and this is just an observation from over the weekend, the rally in Tulsa, if COVID's such like an exaggerated hoax designed to, by the U.S. deep state working in conjunction with the Chi-Coms to destroy Trump's economy and destroy America, then isn't Trump lying through his teeth when he says he saved millions of people from like something that's not even a real threat?
No, that's true. It's pure cognitive dissonance.
They just keep escalating, and I don't see a way legally and lawfully, because things are so paralyzed, to stop the left. And I get what you're saying. Don't interrupt your enemy while they're destroying themselves. But at a certain point, there's a responsibility to stop them. I mean, how do you see that working?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. Normally what I would do is to allow them what Napoleon Bonaparte said, and you said it correctly, which they're making major mistakes. They're continuing with the agitprop. They're continuing with the nonsense about Black Lives Matter, when in fact that's not the real issue. The real issue, and they won't confront it, is how is it that we, the United States, is 27th in the world on education? And guess who leads in the poorest education in America? The Black lives. And instead of talking about Black lives and Black health and Black education, again, the liberals and the left
another extension of the narrative that the Democratic Party is just the plantation that like Black Americans need to leave and go join the freedom of the GOP and Trump. So
and it's all a plantation, obviously, in terms of these Democrats and these Republicans. And I mean, he's right to some extent, but is the people who are actually articulate, I mean, that's why Lee loves to sort of make it all about a single group named Black Lives Matter. But there's actually a serious conversation taking place out there that spans the serious political spectrum, that goes from serious rethinking of policing, the police apparatus in a serious fashion, okay, to the things that Pieczenik just brought up about the question about food and education and all of these kinds of things. And so, sure, there's, elements here that are credible.
Yes, but it's ultimately in the bigger narrative of just like, it's all just the left and it's all just the Democrats, right. And it begins and ends there. And so anyway, the Democrats and the rhinos, I guess, the non-Trump supporting Republicans. Anyway, I digress.
It's the entire program of improvement, and the blacks did not forget that. I grew up in Harlem, and the key issue was always education. Yeah. How do I get a job? How do I get advanced? That's not the answer here. So what happened is this agitprop and the notion of Nancy Pelosi, a mafia daughter, bending down, it was ludicrous. I mean, this is the
so let me ask you this, and Lee Stranahan, what's the next thing they're going to pull? What comes out of the Jack in the Box next with 143 days left? Let me ask Lee Stranahan that. And then Dr.
Pelosi was also the daughter of a Shabbos Goy, a proud Shabbos Goy too, right? And this is ridiculous. Obviously, this is obviously ridiculous stuff. It's such low-hanging fruit to some extent.
Yeah, I believe her father was the former mayor of Baltimore. Baltimore, a very interesting historical location. Her father was a mayor of Baltimore and was a self-professed Shabbos Goy in his capacity as the mayor of Baltimore. I forget his first name. I believe his last name is D'Alessandro.
Right.
Well, we're definitely going to see more protests, but
that's phony as hell, Chuck Schumer. I mean, come on now. But it's they won't.
I'm so angry. Is that Barbara Lee right there? I'm sort of angry at Barbara Lee for facilitating this.
One of the consequences of these types of like limited hangout BS operations is that they won't tell you the real reasons why it's so horrible for someone like Chuck Schumer to be there.
Right, because if here's the two main people here, Shomar, his main thing is defending Israel in the Senate. There's Nancy Pelosi, the one who said that basically she'd rather have DC burn than sort of sever the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And I believe that's Steny Hoyer there to the right. Yes. In there, and he's like the key. He
sponsors the Democrat trips to AIPAC
to Israel, with AIPAC, exactly. So that's sort of like, point that out. It's not about the quote unquote left or the Democrats. It's about this power network.
I believe it's the Hoyer McCarthy 1-2 punch of Kevin McCarthy, Steny Hoyer of sponsoring congressional trips to Israel, along with the 1-2 punch of Schumer and the Senate Republicans coming together on the massive, still unexplained, still unaccounted for post. COVID shutdown bailout. So
I got to agree with the doctor. And let me add something that I think he's going to find interesting.
Doctor, he's sucking up. Sounds like he's sucking up, like he did to, like he tried to do to Bill Ayers on Fault Line.
That's exactly right. Alex.
Interesting. I actually have some insight on the Bolton thing, because I was the lead investigative reporter at Breitbart News under Steve Bannon.
And by the way, what he's about to say here, this is another example of how, like, he's not so much disinformation as he is a propagandist. But yes, there's going to be, I I can believe pretty much everything he's going to say here in regards to this, but there's a lot of stuff that's being omitted and left out. So I think in a lot of cases, Stranahan might not so much be a disinformationist as he is an omissionist. He leaves a lot of things out of his commentaries and his analysis of things.
This is what people have to watch out for. You have to watch out for the people that seem like they're on your side, but aren't. When I used to host the Breitbart radio show, I would pick my own guest. I'd say, I want this person, this person, this person. But they told me Thursdays are Bolton Day. So I had to have John Bolton on. Now, what Steve was doing was softening the ground for the Breitbart audience, which, is a lot of crossover for, let's say, the InfoWars
to accept
audience.
Bolton. So even then, they had the Trojan horse ready and loaded and...
Okay.
And that was the whole problem. Yeah. I just want to point out before you go, Greg, I just want to point out that that Lee was basically insinuating that, he had almost as much editorial freedom at Breitbart as he did at Sputnik Radio.
Yes. And the whole thing with Bolton, this really is like one of the things that I really wanted to talk to Lee Stranahan about. I'll get into this a little bit when I address out, is the legacy of the Breitbart operation and the integrity of the Andrew Breitbart operation that he tries to keep alive when we know, the Breitbart mission, made in America, conceived in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu and Andrew Breitbart and Larry Solov, his longtime childhood friend and current CEO of Breitbart, and Lee Stranahan's other current great friend and the still maintains a great friendship with in the radical fanatical Zionist domestic operative milieu, being Jim Hoft of the Gateway Pundit, all pictured together in Jerusalem at the photo, which was the conception of Breitbart back when Breitbart Jerusalem was conceived in November of 2015, or the establishment of the Breitbart Jerusalem branch. And what he's doing here is it's once again trying to push this this was just an operation. Bannon tried to turn it into a borderline. Bannon and the Mercers tried to turn it into a borderline neocon war supporting operation, when as if that wasn't the case before, back when Andrew was still alive, when you had Ben Shapiro and Dana, let's piss on dead Afghanis lash. They're pushing propaganda and even I still argue that seems to me that Breitbart was in place to vilify people who could be seen as perceived threats or in terms of opposition to support for Israel and the aspects of the war on terror operation. So I think this is misleading to come out push this going in the direction of, Breitbart was this good American genuine grassroots conservative bastion of anti-war, anti-interventionist thinking, when that was not, I don't believe that was the case.
That's exactly right. And Bannon is the guy who recommended Bolton when he was in the White House.
Oh, yeah. Bannon was definitely the guy that brought the whole group of globalists in. So what's at the heart of that?
Remember back when Bannon was a great nationalist patriot before he had his falling out with Trump? I remember Alex Jones saying just that.
Oh, my gosh.
And Lee Stranahan worked directly with Bannon as his pit bull at Breitbart, as we talked about earlier. I mean, it's these guys, they're saying some valid points about Bannon, but it's it's just not a full picture of what went on and continues to go on.
Well, Steve's a Goldman Sachs guy. Let's start there. Don't forget, Steve was with Goldman Sachs.
Did you see Pieczenik Goldman Sachs? Meanwhile, let's go back to who Pieczenik praises here in a couple minutes in contrast with Bannon.
True.
Let's also start with his connection. And here's going to sound like crazy conspiracy theory, but go look it up. His connections to Opus Dei. Go look that up. Anybody can find it.
He's just using conspiracy buzzwords at this point, not really giving any emphasis on what it actually means. I mean, has he ever actually implicated the significance of Bannon being a part of something like Opus Dei? Will he get into William Barr and Opus Dei? I don't know.
He's not going to talk about.
Or is he just throwing out their conspiracy buzzwords, like when he would reference the Rothschilds from time to time on Sputnik?
No, he supports Opus Dei Barr's use of police action against for the photo op.
But are we going to get anything more than just references to conspiracy-oriented buzzwords? I don't know.
And
all right, so Pieczenik's nodding his head. Let's hear from Dr. Pieczenik. Go ahead.
Lee is absolutely right. I was against Bannon from the very beginning. He had contrived to hiss.
I wonder if that's true. I'd have to go back and hear some of those audios, but I can't because the YouTube channel has been permanently removed, and it's very hard to find those audios now, track them down.
Oh, it's interesting the double upside for propaganda networks in terms of deplatforming and banning and stuff like that is, first of all, activates reverse psychology. He must be over the target. It's like Tucker Carlson, the Anderson Cooper of the right, basically, sort of like is obviously over the target. He's being attacked by the left and Disney and stuff like that. And it then erases the archive of the propaganda themselves.
Yeah, and these commentaries would have been around the time that Steve Pieczenik, another now deleted video from YouTube, and still able to track down, but much more difficult to track down because of the complete YouTube scrubbing of the InfoWars archives, this would have been around the time when Steve Pieczenik was thanking former Secretary of State James Baker, who appeared on stage with Hillary Clinton, but when Clinton bursting out into laughter over a joke about, bombing Iran, thanked him for recommending Rex Tillerson for Trump for the State Department. So it would have been around the time of those types of programs and interviews with Pieczenik. So they might be able to be tracked down, but it's very difficult to. So it's not as easy to clarify whether or not Pieczenik's being honest in like his principled opposition to Bannon from the start, or if he's just
it's not, and even I think he's telling the truth that he was opposed to the Bannon from the beginning, but it's not even principled. It's just you can tell from the way he always talks about it. It's just because Bannon's a self-aggrandizer. A Bolton. Sure. Bolton's just a self-aggrandizer, and that's the whole issue.
I guess what I would sum that up by saying is that, Jones and Stranahan certainly weren't against Bannon from the beginning. And
you were talking about Bannon and not Bolton.
Yes, Pieczenik saying he was against Bannon from the start. I wonder how true that is, because InfoWars was very much propping up Bannon as like the great patriot who was going to lead the Trump campaign to victory. And then once Bannon started running his mouth about diamond smugglers and Jared Kushner
and the rabbis in Africa and the diamonds and all that greasy shit,
enemy of the campaign. Yeah. Around that time at some point. And they're going to get into Roger Stone and Bannon, which is another interesting thing that needs to be dissected. So anyway.
History that was absolutely nonsensical. Number one, he was one of the lackeys of Goldman Sachs. Number two, you don't go to become a managing director at Goldman Sachs. I'd been a managing director at Kidder Peabody, and the first thing I did was to take down $600 million because it was corrupt and send it over to the SEC. Bannon couldn't do that. Bannon knew there was corrupt.
Peabody.
Bannon knew he was.
Interesting.
I think Pieczenik was a banker at some point. Yeah,
that wouldn't surprise me.
Was a self-aggrandizer, talking about his naval experience somewhere out in the Pacific.
And what is he doing hanging around with Epstein all the time?
Jesus Christ! See, it becomes fair game. Anytime you're a critic of Trump's, or anytime you're seen as like, even though Bannon's not a critic of Trump, he's still basically doing propaganda for Trump on behalf of like, the whole China COVID thing or on the Trump operation. But anytime you're seen as like a critic of Trump's, you're seen as like the enemy, it's okay to criticize you over Epstein ties, but just don't do it with Trump himself or like anybody who's seen as like good for Trump.
Yeah, Trump took down Epstein in order to get some money from the fertilizer king.
Because he was in the business of Hollywood. Bannon, am I correctly? He was always sucking up to somebody. And Bannon
this is great because you guys, both of you, have such deep research, Lee.
Well, it's not. It's first off, Alex, thanks for bringing up the Epstein thing. Steve Bannon met with Jeffrey Epstein. This is firsthand from people at Breitbart who told me he met with Jeffrey Epstein before the election. He's also met with him multiple times after the election.
He mentioned before the election, and this would have been like around the time just after the election when the Rybolovlev plane was trailing the Trump campaign, the newly elected Trump administration, soon to be Trump administration, transition administration, and also when the Rybolovlev yacht and jet were stationed next to the Mercers out somewhere in the Atlantic. So I wonder what Stranahan knows about those things, because it's like, this is significant stuff, but like I get the impression when you think of that and you think of the Rybolovlev Trump Epstein connection, it's not far-fetched to say these are all interrelated.
That's a good point.
And Bannon, in his capacity, is basically heading the Trump campaign, meeting with Epstein just before the election. I think it's related to all of this, very likely.
In Paris and in New York. But Steve, you're exactly right. Bannon's a Hollywood guy. The guy he was hooked up with there, Digital Entertainment Network. It's interesting how Bannon, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying Steve Bannon is a pedophile. I'm saying
but he's putting it out there like, maybe look into it, people. Which I don't know, maybe, but there's some disturbing shit about Bannon. But I mean, it's just interesting how he said that, like he had to throw that in there. Like,
yeah.
That's almost like you're like telling people go look and see if he was. It's like it's a kind of a dog whistle in a way. And there is some very disturbing stuff about Bannon, and nothing would really surprise me with that somebody like that. But it's interesting he just threw that in there. It's like, why did you feel the need to throw that in? He did that before on Fault Lines as well. So
seems to know a lot of them. He was working with Digital Entertainment Network. Look them up. And he was also working with a group that was literally with World of Warcraft mining stuff. And they would hire basically Chinese prisoners, and they would have them be on World of Warcraft all day, get fake gold. And that hooks him up with a number of people too.
Well, let me expand on this. I don't want to bring myself into this. I haven't.
Let's see what Alex says here in a second. But this is interesting when he's talking about Bannon and World of Warcraft, and he ties in Steve Bannon as being a key player in Gamergate, which I can see as being valid. But this is another example of like where basically Stranahan still continues to run cover for the bigger Breitbart operation is being identified as what you call the Death Star of the 2016 campaign from a propaganda perspective, is that he tells a story of when he left Breitbart for several months to go to Syria or whatever, which is interesting. He was in Syria around the time of the U.S. The chemical weapons and all that going on with Gouda and all that. That's interesting considering what he later went on to do with Russia and the Russian aspect of the whole Syrian operation. But he said he came back and Bannon had brought in all these people and basically turned Breitbart into something that was unrecognizable from what it was before. So there you go. Once again, like Bannon and the Mercers are like the big boogeymen of like who tainted Andrew's legacy. So another aspect of that there was coming out when he was doing stories on interviews about Gamergate and Steve Bannon on Fault Lines. And very interestingly, he's going to have, he's been teasing Pete Santilli to come on to expose Bannon onto his Populist.tv show as well.
And it seems like
an interesting person.
Yeah, oh yeah, and Santilli is basically, I think it seems like he's the producer of Lee's show at some level, or is like hosting its broadcast, and so that is very telling too.
On that, go ahead.
You're right though that in terms of like the way that there's a lot of there is some serious research here in terms of what Lee's saying about Bannon's background, and that he is though also sort of choosing to emphasize some of these lower level information operations that Bannon was involved in rather than deal with like Cambridge Analytica in a similar way that people who like only deal with like the Internet Research Agency and stuff like that avoid the pervasiveness and how big the Cambridge Analytica operation
Or let's even hear Stranahan talk about his mentor and best friend, Andrew Breitbart's relationship with, Matt Drudge and the Israeli Likud deep politics of a lot of involved with Drudge breaking the Lewinsky story and other serious propaganda Drudge has done over the years, particularly in the Bush administration, being a primary aggregate consortium of stories that were very much tipping the scales in favor of the Bush administration's war on terror propaganda. So let's hear at least Stranahan talk about that stuff. If you want to get into a real deep dive.
Look at Pieczenik's face too. First of all, he's like, Alex is like doing his, I don't want to make it all about me, but I was just, cooking up my neighbor's butt and I just want to talk about it a little bit. But Pieczenik's also like looking at Lee, I think like, yeah, this is a guy I could work with. This is that's perfect.
So I guess I'll lay out a prediction. I would not be surprised to see Lee Stranahan join the InfoWars crew in some capacity. I mean, we'll see. Maybe he won't, but I mean, I think at the very least there'll be some overlap where there will be more interviews like this, and maybe Stranahan will be popping up on InfoWars to blame George Soros for getting him removed from.
He's gonna replace Roger Stone's dindu ass.
There you go.
I haven't revealed this yet, but I confirmed from two people in Florida and one in D.C. that Bannon a couple of years ago, when they were trying to indict me as a Russian agent, he would offer people to fund them congressionally that had worked here and others if they would just make up stuff about me. So why would Bannon be spending hard energy and time trying to get Alex Jones? Who does he really work for, Dr. Pieczenik?
And here's the thing. I mean, you could say that this is like grandstanding, but I could see this also being true, okay? I see that this is likely true, and I would say that there would be there's some research worth doing into like the nature of like some possible very real splits within these varying anchors, branches of the bigger 2016 operation. So it's interesting. And I mean, I don't think that Alex is making this up, that like that Bannon was paying people to basically, I don't know if he was paying people to lie about Alex Jones, just paying people to say certain things about Alex Jones that may or may not be lies, knowing Alex Jones, and that he is basically a, you know, chronic liar in terms of like a lot of the propaganda he pushes. But there is some legitimate research to be done into the nature of some of these possible very real splits within varying branches of the Trump operation, the 2016 operation, that ultimately come together to basically run cover collectively for the bigger, whatever the bigger overall goal is that's at hand, that all these entities collectively and separately worked for to make happen.
Remember the concept I said a few days ago is called envy. Envy, as opposed to jealousy, means I want to be in the position of Alex Jones, but I'm not going to let Alex be there. I'm not going to be there. And
Pieczenik might be bragging about another one of his creations here, the current incarnation of Alex Jones, by the way. We talked about Tom Clancy. This might be Pieczenik stroking Alex's ego to brag about another current creation of his, being Alex in his current form. I don't know, but it's possible.
I'm going to destroy both Alex Jones and InfoWars. And Lee is correct. That's exactly what a sociopath like Bannon will do, or Bolton, and a whole bunch of them. They will go out and try to emulate you, but at the same time, they will do everything and anything they can, sub rosa or overtly, to manipulate you.
And that's the same way Bolton wants to get Trump, because he'll be a big man if he gets Trump.
Correct, but he's not going to get him. What happens is when they go on this adventure of trying...
If Bolton really wanted to get Trump, he'd be spilling a hell of a lot more than just what he put out in his book, which is pretty damning in some aspects of it, but it's not really the serious stuff that would bring a Trump operation down. You deceivers here.
And Bolton's just envious of the level and the scale of the mob operations that Trump is, the failed businesses that Trump runs in order to wash mob money. And the level of the sort of the salacious details behind Plato's retreat that Trump has gotten away with, as opposed to Bolton.
And that's one
the
more
major
thing.
problem here.
Very possible. And that's one more thing, and I'll mention this real quick in relation to like the InfoWars Stranahan kind of very much being at odds with the whole Bannon Breitbart operations. And I could see that as being that this might be where the rubber hits the road between like the aspects like Bolton, Bannon, both seeming to be very uncomfortable with some of the aspects of like the overtly Soviet sphere mobbed up aspects of this operation surrounding people like Jared Kushner and others, as opposed to the just, I think, the very combination. I mean, not to say that they're not all interconnected with each other, because they are, but I mean, where you have like Breitbart, and you even have somebody like John Bolton is like the foreign policy, the hawk of the whole Mercer foreign policy, Mercer Adelson foreign policy contingent. But they're, you know, it's like they're not quite as in bed with this obviously very easily exposable as far as terms of becoming very damaged goods very, very easily with certain information getting out. And they're just more focused on the domestic goals of like the whole American Conservative Council for National Policy milieu, combined with the really making foreign policy into a vessel to serve like a lot of the policies that are very favorable to the Likud in Israel. So, I mean, there's as I said once before, there's some very real like things, policy differences, splits that need to be evaluated and analyzed, but also in the context of still, you know, these people are not actually exposing each other, and they're ultimately still part of a bigger operation at play.
Yeah, good. That's a
bring
good point.
down Alex Jones. I'll pay the first $100 to see the battle, because there's no way in hell, let me say that.
He's basically saying there's no way anybody's going to take him down. I'm becoming convinced that like this is a Pieczenik operation, like Pieczenik's talking for himself on behalf of Alex Jones. That's what I think's going on here.
That's the way he acts, like for at least the last 5 years. When Pieczenik comes on, he talks about it. He basically tells Alex what his operation is, and he's like, "No, Alex, you're not understanding what it is. It's this. Alex Jones is this." He'll say things like that. Alex Jones is this.
Yes, and I think I'm starting to get the impression he's talking about himself, and Alex Jones like a front man almost. I can't prove that, but that's the impression I'm getting. And it's amazing that we've been doing this for close to 4 years, and this is the first time we've really zeroed in on Steve Pieczenik. Expect more.
Yeah, it's true. It's like Alex Jones is when like Pieczenik's Tom Clancy operation went live.
Yeah.
Alex is going down.
Well, I don't need to put myself in the story, but I learned like Bannon is creeping around, and you're right. He names his shows after us. He follows it all because he's fake. For him, it's all screenwriting.
And by the way, Stranahan, I don't know if I'm not saying that he actually named his show after us, but the AnteDote did come before the Fault Lines Radio that is then taglined as the antidote to propaganda. I'm just saying,
American
in terms of the timeline.
There you go. Yeah, but
It's what we're doing. It's not that we're even that important. It's just he just lifts an identity because he's a sociopath.
But he never, you got to understand, he never created what you did out of nothing. Sub Rosa, you put together way before now.
Out of nothing.
Sub Rosa is also an intelligence term, too.
Yeah, out of
Sub
nothing.
Rosa, you put together something out of nothing.
Yeah, out of nothing with all the WorldNet Daily, Drudge Report advertisements as early as 1999. I mean, color me skeptical.
Yeah.
11, you put together a show that wasn't all that popular, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, it started to blossom.
It's interesting is, as sophisticated an operative as Pieczenik is, he relies so much on people being ignorant of like the actual stuff he's talking about. It's amazing dynamic.
Like me would come in and we just enjoyed it. And sometimes we would have a wonderful time and sometimes we disagree. But Lee is correct. The amount of Hollywood entertainment that he was involved with, the amount, and he failed. In contrast, let me give you a man who's not a sociopath, and that's Steve Mnuchin, who's the Secretary of Treasury.
There it is, Mr. Goldman Sachs Mnuchin, Hollywood Mnuchin, but he's going Yale Mnuchin, Skull and Bone, but he's going to lay out why Mnuchin is.
So the problem was not that Bannon was Yale, Goldman Sachs, and Hollywood. It's that he was a failed. So Goldman Sachs, Hollywood, and Yale are good unless you're a failure.
Yes, Bannon was, I believe, it was a combination of Georgetown, the Jesuit institution, and then the Harvard Business School.
Oh, right. Bolton was Yale, and Bannon was Georgetown. Right.
Georgetown and Harvard, yes.
Treasury, who in fact was with Goldman Sachs, but what made him different was, unlike Bannon, he had 8 to 9 films that were successful in Hollywood as an executive producer.
Successful propaganda, yes, that's right.
We've done deep dives on Mnuchin, I believe, a couple of our shows. One where we dove into Trump's relationship with the media, particularly Jeff Zucker of CNN, and then there have been a couple other shows where we've really delved into the nature of Mnuchin's Hollywood success that Steve Pieczenik is touting the virtues of here.
Yeah. I mean, that's a key one actually to go back to. I think that might have been the Trump and the media one that we did in 2017, and where we deal with, because that shows a lot of the network actually, because you see Blavatnik, who's a key figure to understand in all of this, comes in, it looks like, to sort of even help take over aspects of Mnuchin's share in the in aspects of Rat Pack Dune Entertainment. There's also James Packer is involved in that. James Packer, this Australian billionaire who lived, I believe, next to Netanyahu, involved like people like Arnon Milchan in the and Sheldon Adelson in the Netanyahu corruption investigation, and all of those chairs are being shuffled as Trump and then Mnuchin are coming into power. And what Pieczenik's also not saying, of course, is that, okay, these are successful films. It's true. Mnuchin got involved out of Goldman Sachs in big scale Hollywood movies, including some of the most key pieces of war on terror propaganda, I believe, such as American Sniper.
Yes, good point. And this is indirect. It's not a direct. It's an indirect, I would say, connection to Lee Stranahan, to this whole Arnon. What you mentioned, Arnon Milchan, and then even going back into the history with what we've broken down with Hungary and Milchan and Andrew Vajna is, of course, the Arnon Milchan Oliver Stone connection, with Arnon Milchan being the man behind JFK, which left out any type of serious or any type of inquiry into an Israeli role in the Kennedy assassination whatsoever. Then you've got Lee Stranahan appearing in the movie that Oliver Stone was involved with on Ukraine. Just an indirect connection, may not even really mean anything, but it's interesting in the bigger scheme of things that you've got. As we talked about before, Oliver Stone in our last live stream, and his the conjunction of Oliver Stone in Arnon Milhan, JFK, and then and I believe there may have also been a connection with Oliver Stone's Nixon movie, which I've never seen as well. And then Oliver Stone playing the role of the critic, the borderline Holocaust World War II revisionist who says Hitler's being vilified by the Jewish-owned media. Interesting, with Oliver Stone being part Jewish himself, and then Oliver Stone being the champion of like Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, while going on television saying that Stephen Colbert's show saying Israel interfered in the U.S. presidential election, while also being a primary propagandist for Russia here in the West via his series of interviews with Vladimir Putin.
It's interesting observation because it does seem like Oliver Stone and Lee Stranahan are actually sort of right and left, media mirrors of somewhat of each other. Both key players in the Ukraine sort of narrative of aspects of the part of the horseshoe media that tries to cover up the Trump-Russia operation. So that is interesting. And then just going one more time back to Mnuchin and Rat Pack Entertainment, the Brett Ratner, not only are there the allegations, the replete allegations throughout high-powered Hollywood about sexual abuse, about underage pedophilia issues, but then also Ratner had a background of having sort of grown up in close to Meyer Lansky, and apparently met Meyer Lansky when Ratner was a kid, and claimed to not know who Meyer Lansky was, but sort of apparently sort of knew him. So there you go. So that network is very, very clear. And then the other thing with Mnuchin is not only is he second generation Jewish skull and bones, but he also was the roommate while at Yale, I believe, of the cousin of the key Iraqi asset of the neocon network, Shalabi's nephew, I think, is who Mnuchin lived with or was a roommate with while he was at Yale at some point. So it's a very dense background there.
Yeah, and it's certainly not Mnuchin just being the successful made. So once again, another one of these people who made something out of nothing. I mean, it's just complete.
Total vulture billionaire too, in terms of, if you see what he did in relationship, go read the articles about what Mnuchin was up to in the run up to the 2000, or I think both in the run up and in the aftermath of the 2008 housing financial collapse. Vulture billionaire.
We heard all about Madoff, but nothing about Mnuchin. Anyway,
and trust me, as
Madoff was probably the Epstein of the bailout. Taking the fall for anyway, I digress, but an
executive producer of the Clancy franchises, that was tough. Bannon could never do that. And
it's hard to have straight winners, and so.
But he won't talk about. Of course, they won't talk about how Bannon was at the forefront of the massive psychological warfare operation known as Cambridge Analytica, because that doesn't fit their narrative, because it's just basic.
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg. Bannon was actually the sort of the architect of the live. He was the producer of the live fly version of all this Hollywood crap that they're talking about. That Alex Jones is really Pieczenik's next generation of the Tom Clancy, operation at some level. Bannon is the one who took that successfully live and deployed the Hollywood operation via Cambridge Analytica and Breitbart and the talking points and the psychometrics into a serious, ongoing color revolution, Lee.
And, Lee would know about this. Bannon basically took Andrew Breitbart's what he had going on and made it into a very viable political machine is really what he did. I mean, because Andrew Breitbart mainly relied on like activism, kind of being like the firebrand outsider who would just who would yell and scream at the politicians. Obviously there were political connections as well, but Bannon and the Mercer money made it into, with Bannon at the helm, made it into the political machine force that it became, that was able to be strong enough to really make the Trump election a reality.
Yep.
And so, but they don't want to bring that stuff up because that implicates all of them, that bigger operation. And plus, I wouldn't be surprised if Pieczenik there's Pieczenik connections to all that as well. But anyway,
it's just important to understand the mindset of these guys.
Yeah, they're basically sociopaths.
The limited hangout mindset of these guys.
I'm sorry, Lee. Go ahead.
Well, no,
Go ahead,
I was
Lee.
just going to say, and by the way, I will give Steve Bannon credit for directing the film Occupy Unmasked, because I'm in it mainly. But
I do have to go
Hey.
watch that.
Yeah, Bannon gave Stranahan a shout out as being one of the guys who really helped expose Occupy along with Andrew. So I'm sure Lee would be proud to know he got a shout out on Bannon's War Room podcast.
I mean, I was at Occupy LA with my wife, and we saw exactly what was going on from the ground level. So I'd be interested to see the level of the limited hangout and the partisan framing of the expose of Occupy that was, Breitbart and Lee Stranahan.
Yeah.
Bannon, after I left Breitbart, I have the emails, Alex. I was trying to warn Bannon about the Ukraine thing over and over and over. I said, it's all about Ukraine. I was sending him this in early 2017. He didn't ignore me. He tried to destroy me. And I'll tell you something else, Stu. And Alex, I don't know if you know this, but this is firsthand.
Before we get into this real quick, with Stranahan, with Bannon ignoring Stranahan on this, if Bannon is so just opposed to all this, why didn't Breitbart under his watch and under the watch of his pals, people who, Alex Marlowe types, why didn't they just go after Trump on this stuff instead of just covering for the bigger overall narrative? This is all just a big witch hunt and a myth, the collusion idea. So why didn't they just see? Maybe they'd say it's about Israel or something, but I mean, still, I don't know if there's a good answer to be had for that. Why they just, if they're so hostile to it, why didn't they just, to the facts about it, why didn't they just, why did they just run cover regardless?
Yeah, Bannon probably knew that Manafort was bundling Ukrainian information operations via, Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and maybe Avigdor Lieberman into the heart of Breitbart. That's why he was not going to go there with on the Ukraine question that Lee was trying to warn him about, because he knew it was real.
But they never, they're painting this out like these are like the enemies of Trump when they just ran cover for everything. And anyway, it's frustrating anyway.
From the people involved. Steve is working with Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec now. I know people who were working directly with them, and they told me their goal was to destroy you. That they wanted to get all, and this is at the time when those guys were on the network, and somebody who worked directly with them.
This is a job application.
Talk all the time about.
This is interesting. I wonder where the truth goes with this, and if there is truth, and I suspect there is. What is the nature and what is the means of it, and what is the objective behind those guys working like that? And these are questions that need to be explored and answered if they're true, and it might reveal a lot about things that we're trying to figure out. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is stuff that Lee has repeated over and over and over, and now he's sort of adding this little key flavor as part of his job application.
I agree. This does
InfoWars,
kind of seem like an application. Look, also another subtlety to a job application. Look at how nicely he's dressed up here.
Yeah. He's like, I could do this. I could do this even better than Roger Stone.
He doesn't want to appear on Roger Stone's.
Who didn't do nothing wrong.
Yeah, he doesn't want to appear on Roger Stone's worst dressed list like Steve Bannon does.
You could not be more right. And again, this is not conjecture. This is absolutely firsthand from the people involved who know what's going on.
Lee is correct. Yeah. I mean, I believe everything you said, and I'll tell you why, Alex. The one thing you have to understand, my dear friend, is
you got to understand it, Alex. He always says that. Always tells Alex what he needs to understand.
Look at Alex.
You create envy, not just jealousy, but envy. Out of nowhere, you come in.
Steve Pieczenik creates people that are envious of him.
They hate you because you're so good, Alex. You're like Trump. Yeah. You're too good.
I'm really thinking Pieczenik saying they hate you because I'm running you. That's what I think.
It's just a a jerk of self-aggrandizement. It sounds like to me, based on resentment.
I mean, we talk about Pieczenik possibly being a handler of InfoWars, but at the end of the day, is InfoWars a Steve Pieczenik operation? I don't know. Is it just? I don't know. Anyway, future questions for future consideration here. The way Steve Pieczenik's talking here.
And you're very effective, you're very funny, and at the same time, you're very serious, and you created, oh my God, millions of people who enjoy what you do.
And how about his cooking?
The basis of threatening the sociopaths who cannot create a company, who cannot do anything but self-aggrandizement and process. And that was abandoned. But you have to understand.
But it's the same reason they hate you or Trump or Stranahan or anybody. Exactly. Why they hate America. Because America isn't controlled.
But that's my point. Guys like me who get involved in whether it's psyops or, agitprop, we back off. And if you want to see
Alex almost seems a little lost here, actually.
Yeah. Be like and Lee's like, oh my gosh, we're talking about agitprop with an agitprop guy. And that's what's interesting is I noticed and I commented on some of Lee's when he's playing his documentary, his raw documentary. I was like, oh, this is agitpropaganda about agitpropaganda, which is what all of this is, actually.
And he was describing agitprop, not like seeing like the irony that this is exactly what you're doing. That the left specializes in it.
Pieczenik does, then go read a novel. I'm not interested other than you.
If you want to know what Pieczenik does, read a novel. That's what he just said.
Like a Tom Clancy Op Center Balance of Power this summer novel.
Yeah.
Closing comments from both of you when we come back in 2 minutes. Please stay there. StevePieczenik.com. We've got Lee Stranahan with us, thepopulist.us. This is powerful radio today.
No mention of Sputnik, though, still.
I don't want to bring myself into the story. It's just that people.
He doesn't want to bring himself into it. I can also see a scenario where Alex is just so like self-congratulating that Pieczenik just plays off of that, and like Alex actually thinks he's he's like Alex. It's amazing. I mean, he does this all the time. He strokes his ego, and it's amazing. But
in this case, I think there's an age-based hierarchy of handler qualities here, from Steve to I think Lee to Alex, basically. And Alex is a good handler too, obviously. Like that's and look the way he treated Owen. Yeah.
Owen Schroyer would be the younger aspect of that. Owen Schroyer and that little shit Harrison Smith would be a younger aspect of that.
Around all day and are so pissed about me, as if I went away, they would suddenly be me. It's just ridiculous. We'll be right back. Stay with us. All right, Dr. Steve Pieczenik's our guest, so is Lee Stranahan. So in closing, gentlemen, other points you'd like to make, and what do you think Trump should do right now? Let's start with Steve Pieczenik.
I'm about to eat my neighbor's butt meat.
Get rid of Esper again. I said Trump should get rid of Milley again. My boys in the military intelligence wanted to know why with Milley, but now he came out to be exactly what I said, self-aggrandizing. Get rid of all these generals who are not relevant. The relevance is cyber war, space warfare. At the same time, he has to go out and do all of his speeches in conservative areas.
Just don't challenge Trump in any way, shape, or form.
And don't bring in the multipolar aspect and how the relationship of China and Israel and Russia and Israel.
Yes.
And just knock them out of the park, because that's what he does best, and that he will.
So he has to go on total offense and just ignore all the attacks.
Well, they're not relevant. It's the same way it's not relevant to Alex Jones. If you want to know who Alex Jones is, that's sui generis. He's an entity unto himself. Don't bother yourself about it, because you're never going to be him. So forget about it.
And he's mine.
Now, I would say Trump is exactly who he is. He's a Trump tower. He's a Trump building. He's a Trump entity.
Who stands behind
like you?
Trump Tower.
Oh, yes. It goes back to a combination of the coming together of the old Lansky Jewish mob syndicates and the Italian, the remnants of the Italian Luciano mob syndicate, and then bringing the CIA and bringing aspects of the American intelligence into the picture with Resorts International and I believe Mary Carter Paint Company, and aspects of that going back to the Kennedy assassination. That's what stands behind Trump.
And there's a lot of Norman sort of Vincent Peale sort of 33rd degree Mason sort of, you're a builder, you're a creator.
That's a good point.
That
Masonry, once again, going back to Masonry, the building and the architect of the universe and all that good stuff. I mean, it's fair, and that's the great architect. It's so, but they won't say that because, that's supposed to be affiliated with the evil, deep state Democrats. But I mean, that's what it seems to be what it is. And I go back again, just another digression, Trump always making the pyramid hand signal. I don't know. It's very interesting.
That creates.
Well, enough about me. All you guys, America is individuals. It's beautiful.
Oh, God.
Well, yeah, but you're American. You got to understand something. Biden is not American in that sense. He's a product of the DuPont family. He's a product.
See, now we're going to name off everybody Biden's indebted to, but Trump is a self-made man. It's so ridiculous.
It's true. I mean, this would be great stuff if like it were applied evenly, because he's. I think this is a key piece of this. Actually, is the DuPont backing of like Biden and the Delaware,
but you
and
can also
all
guarantee that there's overlap too. I could practically guarantee you.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, why do they hate America? I don't even know. Why don't they just be it and own it? They literally have a problem with it.
Because he's never been involved with every time he was asked to come and serve our country.
Lee can be himself now. He doesn't have to deal with people like Medea Benjamin anymore and pretend to pretend to pay lip service to like the the leftist critiques of American empire anymore.
Yeah.
Avoided it. He didn't want to do anything that was consistent with a product or a dynamic other than the process. These guys only live by process. That's why they're ineffectual. They're impotent. They're eunuchs, and they're political eunuchs, and that's why they're not relevant to the United States. What's relevant to
you know what? You always say this for 20 years on the show, 19 years, and I would kind of like, but it's so true. They would just want to own a farm or take it over. They don't even want to get into how it works. It could be one thing if they know how it worked. They don't want to know how it works because they don't want to have any emotion given to it because they're so dead.
No, it's another issue. It's like you, Alex, and I, and Lee. It's not about just emotion dead. They don't want to take the risk and the concept that they can fail. Every time you go on the air for 20 years, you have to perform the same way you did the day before and the next day. They can't do that. They can't create something where it takes risk, calculated risk, going on the line, and failure. These are the sociopaths. That's why process is their mother lode.
Trump risks failure, and failure for him ultimately results in him getting bailed out of his failures. Yeah,
failing upward as a money laundering mob stratagem. Yes.
Yes, who's better alive than dead to very, very, very powerful interests.
When it comes to creating corporations, they're out of the game. And that's why Trump will come back again.
Well, I want you to come on the show soon because you're a smart guy and tell us how we can kick people like this out of our society. StevePieczenik.com. Thank you so much, Doc. We appreciate you. Have a great weekend.
Pleasure.
Lee, thanks. We got 2 minutes left. Closing comments on how we turn this around.
Well, first, let me agree with what the doctor said. Trump absolutely has to get rid of people like Esper Manili as soon as possible. If the coup comes,
is that like Milli Vanilli?
Let me also say one other thing too.
Oh, because he doesn't want, because they perhaps in a staged manner stood down Trump, threatening to send the military in to deal with the Antifa commies, right, Lee?
Let me take it off you. We've been talking about you, and it's all true. But let me mention the other guy who was Bannon's target here, someone you know
here
well.
We go.
Roger Stone. Roger Stone,
who didn't do nothing wrong.
All these guys went after Roger because they know that there were two people who understood politics and had experience on the Trump team in 2016. Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. And notice what happened. And I was told by somebody who I'm not
you're right. They were
name.
more scared of Stone than they were. You're right. They were obsessed with Stone.
And I was told by somebody firsthand, Alex, so I'm not going to tell you who it is. I'm not going to tell anybody who it is because they're in fear that Bannon knew that Manafort was going to be taken out, which is why Bannon got himself in position.
Probably that was very possibly a coordinated handover of the campaign.
Of course it was. And it needed to happen because they were about to lose.
Yes. And it's just, but this is so, there's good analysis, but it's what it leaves out that's just so infuriating. And once again, they're insinuating somehow like all these Bannon like operatives are somehow like operating against Trump when like that's just so preposterously absurd.
And it should say Dindu, I think. I think it's spelled wrong on Roger Stone's shirt there.
Right.
What? Roger Stone didn't do nothing wrong.
The thing Trump has to do is do what the base wants him to do. Pardon Stone and pardon Manafort, especially, because Manafort actually knows what's going on with Russiagate. He was trying to warn Trump, and that's why they got him gagged.
I was thinking he should bring Manafort back on the campaign to piss in their face.
Oh, my gosh.
That's exactly right.
This is out of control.
Yes, it is. I forgot it being this bad at the end.
Knows what's going on with Ukraine. He knows the truth about Russiagate. He was
that
taking
it's
notes
true,
from-
that it's worse than's been said, because he was in the midst of all of it, up Dmitry Firtash's ass.
Yes, exactly.
Again next week. Join us on Sunday. We love you. Lee Stranahan. All right, coming up.
All right.
We've got Dr. Nick Baggage.
Okay. Wow, that was...
I can't believe we survived that, Greg.
Man, oh man, oh man! But I'm glad we went through that. May have been a little long-winded at points, but I'm glad we went through that. So I'll tell you what, since we've gone so long here, I think I want to talk a little bit about the nature of my interaction with Lee Stranahan. I think what I will do for time's sake is I'll try to, number one, keep it in a reasonable time period, but also I will separate this portion for a separate video for people who might just want to hear like the ins and outs and the specifics of like, this whole Stranahan deal, the reason why, I, and to an extent also you have been so kind of zeroed in on trying to understand the dynamics of what's going on here. So I will splice what we're going to talk about next off into a separate clip after we get this uploaded, but I'll try to do this within like a reasonable time period now since we've gone for so long. But I guess, Jeremy, we first dealt with the topic of I don't know if I should turn the screen sharing off or just keep it going. I don't know.
Just leave it there.
Okay. We'll look at Alex Jones's macho manly face here for anyway.
I'm eating neighbor butt jerky.
So I think we first noticed Lee Stranahan, and it was around the time of and I guess since I'm going to mention this, we'll just deal with this real quick here. We mentioned we noticed two people who were very interesting in the Trump operation as far as their roles, and this was around the time when we were coming back from Iowa, the day of what we mentioned earlier, the Epstein, the announcement of the death or whatever happened of Jeffrey Epstein. We were driving home from Iowa, and we did a stream where we talked about the parallel courses of Lee Stranahan and Rick Wiles of True News, and that's where we really first started to bring a little bit of focus into Lee Stranahan, and we slowly started looking into the role of things we talked about, like his role of like at Breitbart is Bannon's pit bull, which I didn't know at the time. That's how Bannon described him when we first went into Stranahan, and his role in Idaho, and basically acting on that aspect of the domestic operation in terms of really pushing the fear of Islam and the war on terror and the refugee crisis as a center point of the Trump campaign as far as the propaganda aspect of it. And so from there, we started to look more and more into this program on Sputnik called Fault Lines with Stranahan and Nixon. And that's when you called into for your question about Jeffrey Epstein, which you mentioned earlier. That was from about November or so. And then I'd say I really zeroed in on I was really zeroing in on Fault Lines more and more, but then is when the beginning of the year, the turn of the year, the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020 is when Sputnik announced that it was taking airwaves on 3 stations in here in the Kansas City area. Basically, the KCXL, which is the station that here in Kansas City that airs an hour of the Alex Jones Show every day, interestingly enough.
Interesting.
KCXL, 3 stations in the Kansas City area, 1 AM, 2 FM, and airs Fault Lines among the rest of the Sputnik audience. So we really took notice of Sputnik coming in as like basically a foreign government propaganda operation, airwaves in Kansas City, one of 2 cities that Sputnik operates out of, one being Washington, D.C., and the other being Kansas City. Kansas City is the only other city in the country where
D.C. and KC,
local radio, yes. And so it's very interesting, and that just really piqued our curiosity even more with like Lee Stranahan and seeing like Sputnik as this domestic, basically propaganda operation acting on behalf of the Russian government. And so we more and more zeroed in. I really started looking more and more into Stranahan and connecting more and more dots. And I started to come with some questions that I had regarding, and there was an interesting moment where, in addition to our phone calls that we made that we've detailed on a previous program, we analyzed and played and analyzed phone calls we made into Fault Lines on a previous show we did that you can go back and find from about 3 or 4 months ago. But there was a day when Stranahan and Garland Nixon were making a big deal out of the local Kansas City NPR affiliate, running basically what was labeled as a hit piece against Sputnik. And I can't disagree with that. There's valid information in there, but it's under the guise of just Sputnik being the generic like kind of boogeyman of like the Russian the Russian Cold War era anti-American operation that's just out this, done in a very kind of boogeyman-ish, exaggerated manner, which also I would argue actually runs cover for like what Sputnik actually is trying to accomplish through domestic operations, I would argue. But he made a big deal out of the local NPR affiliate doing a story on Sputnik, and he challenged the person who did this reporting to come on to the Fault Lines show. And so I heard that, and I tweeted at the Fault Lines Radio Twitter account, "Hey, I'm from Kansas City. I'm a critic. I'll come on the show." I was just kind of grandstanding there, to be honest, because I wasn't, I wouldn't know what the hell to do at that time if I had actually gone on the Fault Lines. But I just threw that out there, and the Fault Lines Twitter account answered me. And it turned out it was actually ran by Lee Stranahan's son, Shane Stranahan, who's a producer for the program, and is actually now the new co-host of Fault Lines Radio. And I'll say, without saying much else about Shane, he's been I've had very good correspondences with him, and I wish him the best in that role, in that capacity. But Shane Stranahan offered to basically mediate on my behalf in terms of maybe setting up possible correspondence with Lee Stranahan, and or also encouraging us to call into the show. But I made it pretty clear to him that it's hard to, in a 60 to 120 second time window, to just say everything you want to say. And I have a lot of topics that I'm running through my mind when I make these phone calls. So it's very hard to do that in an environment where you're not in control of the conversation, where somebody else has control of the conversation. So Shane was entertaining the notion of possibly me talking with Lee Stranahan. And then there was, despite some initial cold feet over a program we sent about the program we did where we broke down the phone calls into Sputnik, into Fault Lines, there is still a willingness to perhaps initiate a dialogue between myself and Lee Stranahan. I'd actually sent an email at one point to Shane with a bunch of questions I had regarding what I wanted to talk with Lee about. And then eventually I was even given a number to reach Lee Stranahan himself at, that I had messaged and sent him an introductory message. I never heard back from him. So I like to think Lee Stranahan is the investigative journalist who goes down, is really investigative and tries to do good investigative work. And I'd like to think from that capacity, I tried to be very, and I have receipts of these, emails. I don't want to share it because of the whole confidentiality with Shane Stranahan, who I don't want to bring into this in any significant way. But, I tried to go about this in a very fair manner, very even-handed manner. Tried to be very fair to Lee Stranahan, even in the light of the personal problems he's going through in his life. I made it very clear that I don't want to infringe in any way, shape, or form upon his personal marital issues, any type of health problems he had going on. But I tried to really be adamant about trying to establish a dialogue with my questions for Lee Stranahan, which is basically a microcosm of what we just covered in this long, very long stream here. Combination of Lee's work for Sputnik, the legacy of the Breitbart operation, and how Lee still seems to represent that in its purest form, which is American Zionism, war on terror propaganda thrown in with domestic Tea Party operations. And then the aspect of the types of propaganda basically on behalf of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort that we just discussed. It was a combination of those things that I was really wanting to have a conversation with Lee Stranahan about. And so on the day of the Roger Stone interview on his Periscope channel, we were in there dropping all kinds of information about Roger Stone. I mean, it was pretty, we were really heavy going in and dropping information about it. And then it turns out that after all this time, this past Friday morning, after all this time, after about 4 or 5 months of me trying to reach out and have a serious, honest dialogue with Lee Stranahan, he promptly proceeded to block me on both his Periscope and his Twitter feeds. So at this point, I tried for several months to talk about somebody who I think we have very legitimate, very detailed, very nuanced critiques of. And in the process of that, I was shut down. And so in the aspect of us,
I do just want to say, Greg, that your list of questions for Lee, really what you were doing was a very good faith journalist enterprise, that a journalist, even if they're working, or especially if they're working on a critical story of some sort, they would seek the direct comment from the target of their critical story about the questions that they're interested in. And I read your questions, and they're very, very well developed and very much to the point, and are of full good faith and deserve an answer, I'd say.
Well, thank you for that. And I really did try to do that. And I feel, I'm disappointed, kind of let down, but also like it makes me really, I really get the impression after going through all of this that, Lee Stranahan is somebody I think it's kind of safe to say, I think it's clear to say he clearly has things he'd rather have not be discussed that maybe he's trying to hide, as far as like these relationships he's building with the combination of the very posturing in favor of Russia and the aspects of the the David Horowitz relationship, the Jim Hoft relationship, Gateway Pundit, the heavy-handed, very Breitbart-esque, very friendly with a lot of like Zionist pro-Israel propagandist types of talking points and narratives on making BLM out to be this like ultimate George Soros battering ram against America and freedom boogeyman. Also very Russian centric, as we talked about earlier in the longer stream, with the regards to Russia and Israel having like a common enemy when it comes to Soros, and then the running of cover for Stone and Manafort, and just acting as complete apologists for their long history of operations and all sorts of criminal endeavors. And he's somebody I think at this point, and I feel safe. Like I tried to be fair and equitable and tried to get words with them, tried to have correspondence and dialogue with them, tried to get some answers from them. At this point, with the just some complete shutting down, I have to assert in this interview here, I think is another sign of the evidence of this, that clearly Lee Stranahan's got things that he does not really want to be forthright in discussing in terms of some very important projects that he's involved in.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get that out, and just and because that is, like, I feel is important supplement to this, is that it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate when this happens. And I mean, at least Stranahan's somebody who I think has got to be looked at as a pretty important figure in terms of this whole of this alt media sphere network going on here, and him really inserting himself at this moment into the InfoWars operation in such a big way, with Steve Pieczenik and the seal of approval basically being given here. I mean, I think Lee Stranahan's somebody for people to really begin to put a microscope on in terms of what he knows about the Ukraine operation, which he clearly knows a lot, what he knows about the domestic aspects of the 2016 operation and the continuing operation beyond just, sending out red meat to conspiracy theorists by saying Steve Bannon is a member of Opus Dei and had talked with Jeffrey Epstein on a few occasions.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing about a lot of this too is like some of these crucial figures are important not only because of the role that they specifically are playing, but also to understand the network aspects of information flows, disinformation flows, and because part of one of the things that we work to do on the AnteDote is we work to clarify the situation, and it's a struggle. It's difficult. It's hard. Some of the stuff, we've evolved a lot in terms of our understanding and our thinking, but we like to stick to principles and good faith efforts to give people, the reasonable, some sort of sense of a possibility. But then we like to sort of stick to the facts. And facts that should be answered by certain people when they're not answered is very suggestive.
Yes, indeed. And so, yeah, I'm going to continue to, even though, Lee Stranahan, I guess, is not involved with the Kansas City centric Sputnik operation anymore. I'm going to continue to follow Lee pretty closely, as somebody who I have identified as being a potentially key figure in understanding in terms of this whole alt media dynamic going on. Of course, you mentioned Alan Dershowitz and Jason Goodman and that whole dynamic earlier, and Lee Stranahan having an extended relationship with Jason Goodman, it appears, going back over 3 decades, and what that might consider, with Jason Goodman also being another person to, I think, take a look at, as it seems that there's some, and I haven't followed nearly enough of his streams as I should. I kept up with them, like, for example, the streams he does with people like Charles Ortel, but there's some very key, I think, to understand propaganda points going out through this entire milieu, and Lee Stranahan being a a key part of that. So I guess at this point it's almost like a little personal for me, but like at this point, like I've come to evolved enough to the point to where like I'm pretty safe in like understanding and knowing how to like, you know, anything regarding like, oh man, I'm a little bitter because he blocked me, but like being able to separate that from like serious type of analytical work we're trying to do here at the Antidote, but also not hesitating to go in and like be very critical. And I feel like Steve Stranahan's more than earned a critical eye from us at this point.
Yep.
So I want to wrap this up, unless you have something else you want to throw in. I want to wrap up by, I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, True News and Rick Wiles and the parallels between Lee Stranahan and Rick Wiles. And I wanted to get into a couple of like the propaganda, a classic example of how alt media propaganda works through ostensibly anti, I guess True News and Rick Wiles being the anti-Zionist, anti-Israel critique of aspects of like of Jewish power coming from the evangelical conservative right, and how it's very interesting when you look at Stranahan, you also look at Rick Wiles. I call them outliers within their respective milieus. Lee Stranahan was kind of the outlier from the Andrew Breitbart tree, the nest of Andrew Breitbart, with you have your Ben Shapiro's and your Dana Lash's and your Joel Pollacks and other people who were very much have stayed on like the typical pro-Israel milieu as far as their politics and their talking points. And then you've got Stranahan, who strayed away from that. I don't know if he was ever really Israel centric in the first place. It doesn't seem like he was. He didn't have that passion for like the issues related to Israel that some of these other people did. But I think he probably, he had to toe a line at Breitbart. Then he goes into Sputnik and becomes like this very much into this Russian centric criticism of American aspects of American Zionism, neoconservatism. And he's kind of an outlier from the rest of like the old Breitbart nest, the tree of Andrew Breitbart in that aspect. And then somebody like Rick Wiles, I can look at him as being an outlier from the old evangelical Zionist circles that he used to run in. I mean, he was the guy who got the television licenses for Pat Robertson's network to go on major cable networks, got the licenses for Trinity Broadcasting Network to be launched onto satellite dishes throughout America. And so he's a guy who was at some levels kind of an insider within the evangelical Christian Council for National Policy oriented sphere. And then Wiles, I guess maybe around the time of the Trump inauguration, goes from being a very over the top critic or over the top saber rattler against the Obama administration about the Muslim threat to take over America and destroy us with radical Islam and terrorist attacks and all this and that, calling for Muslims to be removed from the United States after the Orlando shooting, or calling for Mecca and Medina to be bombed after after something back in 2014. He was calling for Mecca and Medina to be bombed. I know Right Wing Watch has the archived audio clip of that, to going to the evolving and just transitioning into the basically saying the same things about, the Jewish influence in the United States after the election and inauguration of Trump. So Rick Wiles, much like Lee Stranahan, is kind of an interesting outlier to follow within like the evangelical milieu. And that's why when we really did that show on the Jew coup, Rick Wiles' classification of the impeachment process as a Jew coup, we really zeroed in on a continuum of talking points and similar narratives being pushed all the way from like the obvious Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity type of neoconservative talk radio milieu to the InfoWars sphere, and then all the way even to people like Rick Wiles, that this is all just a big conspiracy against Trump. And of course, with Rick Wiles, it was thrown in that this was basically part of the Jewish plot to destroy Christianity and subvert America with a Bolshevik Jacobin revolution if Donald Trump is removed from office, and tens of millions of Christians are going to die as a result. So that was when we really took notice of you want to say anything here, Jeremy, while I just talk? Did you want to throw anything?
Well, I'm glad you brought Rick Wiles up again, because what I'd forgotten was I was hoping also that you would talk about what you'd noticed at during his interview with Allison Weir about how he had his conversion to sort of coming to the side of the Palestinians and against the Israelis and the Zionists, and that he sort of found his path to Al-Quds via St. Petersburg, and that he actually did. He said that his trip was in sometime in 2015, I think it was, and that it was during that trip that he saw the way that the Palestinians were being mistreated by the Israelis, and that was part of his conversion. But that he came there directly, it sounded like, and you caught this from
St. Petersburg.
From St. Petersburg, yeah.
And we joked among ourselves. The Apostle Paul had his road to Damascus conversion. It's like the Apostle Wiles had his road to St. Petersburg conversion, and it's very interesting. And it's interesting you mentioned 2015. I didn't hear a year on that. I'll have to go back and listen to that again. But 2015 was also the year when Rick Wiles began popping up at teams more and more on the Jim Baker show. And let's remember Jim Baker through his Christian Zionist propaganda program has guests on right about the time of the Trump victory on, talking about the stories such as like the Pharisees coming from these Zionist websites like Breaking Israel News about how the Pharisees wanted Trump and Putin together to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and also coming in with a lot of that centric type of like apocalyptic Christian Zionism of the tying in Russia to the fortunes of like of bringing in the end time scenarios regarding Israel and God's people. So that's another interesting thing, is that Rick Wiles popped up in there. And once again, our friend John Brisson's done some serious deep diving into aspects of the Jim Baker show and people like Rick Joyner and their connections, some interesting Russian connections there. People can go on John Brisson's channel. We've read the documents. I'll provide a link to a live stream he did on Rick Joyner and the Knights of Malta, and aspects of directly connecting that whole milieu of dominionist propagandists to aspects of people with connections to the Russian government and to Putin himself. So, and
it might have been much more recent. Wiles's trip. Maybe he was saying he didn't sound like he was actually clear about it, but it sounded like it was recent years. So it was probably not that long ago. It was probably more like 2017, actually. I think.
That's possible as well, because I know 2015, still 2016 was going on. He was still as late as after the Orlando shooting going on the Jim Baker show and calling for like Muslims to be basically kicked out of America, banned from this country. So, but
one last thing is that the Allison Weir thing is sort of interesting too, because we've Allison Weir got herself into trouble with the whole. This sort of like the disciplining, controlled part of the Palestinian solidarity movement out of the left sphere, and like people like even like Max Blumenthal, for example, who just got retweeted by the POTUS.
Oh, that's worth the conversation
account.
In and of itself, possibly in the future, in another stream.
There's a whole bunch of stuff there, and also including like sort of laterally connected people trying to sort of praise his Blumenthal's operations and changing his Twitter handle name and stuff like that. But Allison Weir got into trouble with this whole group of people, including like Max Blumenthal and the whole sort of
Ali Abu Nima.
Yeah, and the whole sort of like progressive, largely Jewish controlled aspects of like the progressive approach to Palestinian solidarity, and there's intense message discipline around very specific issues
with apparently it appears a Palestinian American frontman by the name of Yosef Munayr, possibly acting on behalf of even someone like Phyllis Bennett.
Oh, that's yes. And then who's the guy from Electronic Intifada?
Abu Nima, Ali Abu Nima.
Yeah, right. And so they all tried to basically ostracize Allison Weir after she did an interview with a American Freedom Radio, sort of white nationalist adjacent, American Free Press. Adjacent Clayton Douglas, I think his name was, and so that was then used basically against her to just clobber her. And Max Blumenthal played even dirtier because he would try to discredit her well sourced book against our better judgment, which is there's some very important footnotes in that book actually, and that it represents some very crucial research that she did. But when she talks about the Parushim, i.e. the Pharisees, the secret Zionist society that was started in the United States, that was, involved in the deep background of Zionist involvement in helping bring the U.S. into World War I, the Balfour Declaration, sort of how that's going to play out in the aftermath. People like Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis.
And by the way, somebody, a really good source of information on a lot of these ties, and even tying in this turn of the 20th century operation you're talking about here with even current events, is our friend John Swin and his website Expose the Enemy. He's put together some excellent infographics detailing many of these connecting so many of these webs together. So
yeah, and John Swin's exposetheenemy.com has sections too, to be able to understand some of these different issues in a very clarified fashion, where there's like original articles, but also tons and tons of documented links to media, mainstream media from around the world, clarifying a lot of these issues, in addition to his original graphics, which are sort of crucial network analysis, combined with a lot of them have like a lot of factual information layered into it that includes these kinds of networks, like the Parushim network. And so Alison Weir, when Blumenthal was confronted with, I think it was a question about Alison Weir potentially, he basically said that it was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that that Alison Weir had made up about the existence of the Parushim. And so he played super dirty in this. And so I just think it's interesting. There is an aspect where Alison Weir has a tendency to sort of, she seems like I've met her one time at the Left Out Forum. And she seems like a very sweet woman, but maybe there's a certain political naivete about how some of this platforming stuff plays out. And, my own awareness and understanding of how all of that plays out is also, evolving. But I think that it really shows at the end of this Wiles interview, where he had her on to basically discuss the question of the what's called the deadly exchange, the training of U.S. police and command structure in Israel. And this is when Wiles was talking about his road to Jerusalem al-Quds via St. Petersburg scenario. And at the end of it, then it all comes down to a big sales pitch for Wiles' book, The Last Day.
Yeah, which is
at some level, I think it's sort of, it's
tying in Alison Weir's
propaganda. It's agit propaganda of some sort.
It's tying in Alison Weir's very serious, deep research into all things related to Israel and Palestinian plight and Israeli domestic power play operations here in the U.S., and then tying it in with this just over the top, constant, the constant conspiratorial world of Rick Wiles, where everything is weaponized into language that is just so heavy-handed and over the top, and used by the right-wing watches of this world as obvious fodder, and the constant false predictions that come with Rick Wiles. Like, for example, Donald Trump and his family, as of after the Putin meeting, were going to be dragged out of the White House after the Putin summit. I believe right around the time of the Putin summit, he predicted that Trump and his family were going to be dragged out and publicly executed within 72 hours on the lawn of the White House. I mean, it's lumping in Alison Weir's very serious, sober, scholarly research with this heavy-handed, very weaponized, evangelical, end times propaganda that's just full of false predictions. And
it feels like the sort of going back to the roots of the basically of like Tim LaHaye at some level, and sort of like trying to encapsulate someone like Alison Weir in a sort of Tim LaHaye agit propaganda.
Tim LaHaye agit propaganda that, like, actually, it's interestingly, there's a
CNP,
there.
right?
They play off of each other. Yes, Council for National Policy, but basically, it's almost like Tim LaHaye. If Tim LaHaye said there's no rapture, and Tim LaHaye said Israel was the villain.
Right, and Rick Wiles has played both of those roles, I imagine, over the years.
I would think so. I mean, he's been an insider. I mean, I don't think he just it's somebody who gets, put Pat Robertson's network on the map, put the Trinity broadcast. And this is according to his own profile on the True News website. That's not just some guy who's just a know nothing. So, one more thing about Alison Weir real quick. And what I wanted to mention was, I believe it's interesting. I just want to throw this in a little bit of, I believe it was actually that book really Against Our Better Judgment, and some of the revelations of that book really seemed to put a target on her back. Because I believe that Free Press interview with Clay Douglas is something that had been dug up actually from about 4 or 5 years before the campaign really against her began. So that shows me as a sign of, like, maybe even people were looking for something that wasn't so recent to use against her to discredit her within the and tie her, like, to anti-Semitism and tie her to conspiracies about, like, communism being a Jewish plot to subvert, the Goyim and all that. So,
and I got to go back to her book, Against Our Better Judgment: The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel.
Yeah. And so, Rick Wiles, just the last couple of weeks, I mean,
and I just want to point out one of the big reasons why they don't like her, the sort of controlled left version of sort of quote unquote anti-Zionism or Palestinian solidarity, is because she works against the grain of what's sort of allowed to be accepted, which is the sort of Noam Chomsky hypothesis of sort of Israel as just the sort of imperial outpost of the U.S. empire. And so just even her language of the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel is basically, she's already cutting against the grain of the Max Blumenthal sort of
very
network.
Very true. The whole the American tale, it's the Americans are in control, and it's not the other way around. And Israel's just simply like a colonial outpost for the an arm of colonial imperialistic America, and really nothing more than that. And the Israelis
which is
do what the Americans tell them.
Yes, and which is why such things as, like, her depiction and uncovering from both Jewish and Israeli sources of the Parushim of this secret Zionist society is so dangerous to those networks, basically, and their sort of controlled interpretation, because that of course is, and that's also why the whole idea of conspiracy theory, or that's why that Max Blumenthal used the language of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, I think, as a way to try to push her down.
I agree with you. And it might be interesting. We might come around to even discussing that again at some point, because Alison Weir's done some very interesting articles we've talked about that have gotten a little close to some of the other aspects of things that certain Max Blumenthal types rather kept under wraps, like linking Israel and American operations, and bringing people like Len Blavatnik into and using the word Leonard Blavatnik into her article. So it'd be interesting.
And louder in the World Jewish Congress and Russia and all of that type. Yeah. So that's
things that Max Blumenthal won't bring up when he's grandstanding about, oh my God, Trump retweeted me, free Palestine, fire Jared, Trump retweeted me, oh my God. Anyway, so what I noticed with True News, and why I wanted to bring this up, is I think it's pretty significant to understand, like, the levels of, like, propaganda that are being pushed from True News, and the comparisons and contrast. Like you did mention, he had on Rick Wiles interviewed Alison Weir about the Israeli training of American police, and he did a couple other shows on that topic, and so Rick Wiles, there's a combination of two things we'll break down here. Did shows on American police training, or American police being trained by Israelis. Okay, things like, Rick Wiles asserts that things like the chokehold that was used against George Floyd was originated from Israeli training. And I don't know if that particular thing is exactly 100% accurate or not, but I mean, that's what he was basically bringing light to the Israeli aspects of American police training. But then also, while he's basically asserting that Israelis are making American police officers into barbarians and animals, right? With their heavy-handed strong-arm tactics being used against the Black American population here in particular. He also then, within a day or within 24 to 48 hours of this, goes on air and praises Donald Trump, and that's what you talked about earlier with the dynamic of the upside down Bible and clearing out the protesters from the park to go do the big photo op with the Bible in hand. And this is proclaiming that this is the greatest thing Trump's done since he's been elected. He's glorifying Christ's name against the godless communist Antifas, and calling for the military to be put in the streets and to have the Antifa freaks basically be sent to Guantanamo Bay and waterboarded. And so you have, in a 24 to 48 hour span, True News within the dates of it's right in the first week of June. If you wanted to go on their website and find the shows, it's right from the first week of June, right? The day after the photo op in front of the church, which would have been on a Tuesday. I believe that would have been Tuesday, June 3rd, I want to say, right in that time period. And going from condemning Israel for training American law enforcement to calling for the president to use the American military, agreeing, by the way, with people like Tom Cotton. It doesn't get much more Israeli-centric propaganda in the U.S. Senate than Tom Cotton, and also even Noah Pollack of the Emergency Committee for Israel, that we need to bring the military into the streets and then send the Antifa commies to Guantanamo Bay and waterboard them. And by the way, there's something that belies Rick Wiles' conversion idea, is that he's still citing waterboarding as being something appropriate, when you would think he would know by this point that it was a fake, false means to coerce false confessions out of the people blamed for September 11th, largely on behalf of an Israeli-centric operation.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like using the continuity of the falsehood constructed after the 9/11 false flag operation would sort of make sense for someone who's really calling for a continuity of a color revolution in relationship to the Trump operation to be sort of the pinnacle, the sort of the capstone of it, being like calling out for martial law. And we noticed this early on, where Alex was now sort of flipping on all of his previous anti-martial. He's the guy who made a series of like 2 or 3 movies, all anti-martial law, and yet the second that the color revolution of the Trump operation is successful, then bam, everything flips, and it's sort of in line with the Q narrative ultimately.
Yes,
like, now let's use all these police state powers in the proper way against the evil, godless, leftist, globalists, and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's sort of, and I think what happens was they sort of failed. Like the thing got disrupted, and and it wasn't really the case that you needed the National Guard to put down the Antifa insurrection, and all of that is being way overhyped in a way that could only sort of successfully work as part of a sort of a top-down capstone martial law operation that these kind of people, like the people that you talked about before, a Tom Cotton, a Noah Pollack, and then with a sort of side cheerleader like Rick Wiles cheering on the sort of the capstone operation based on this false photo op based on a seditious police action by Bill Barr, the sort of the arch criminal cover-up artist, going way back to Iran-Contra days. But it's mobsters all the way down at this point.
Yeah, I could see Rick Wiles waving a flag and holding a Bible and singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" while the domestic military elements are put into the streets and rounding up the Antifa commie. And by the way, and
it's hard. I just want to say it's hard not to note also, in terms of like in a Christian context, of like almost like a sort of a seditious iconography of some sort that sort of is antithetical to the actual heart of the Christian gospel and the Christian tradition, which fuses faith and moral action. And in this case, for Rick Wiles, it seems like there's so much emphasis on his sort of iconography of the quote unquote last day. And then the sort of the photo op of the upside down Bible in the hand of the anti-Christian, color revolutionary frontman.
It's extreme theocratic, like Christian theocratic dominionist, the ideology that doesn't care about distinguishing between like real displays of, that is willing to latch on to pretty much any like serious display of like of any type of faith-based policy, regardless of how obviously fake and phony it is, as a means to advance the narrative.
Yeah.
And so I'd wrap it up here with that you have these dynamics in place. And then once Milley and Esper came out and Trump kind of pulled back, Trump betrayed the country by not ordering the military into the streets, basically. And so you come full circle from the Israelis are training U.S. law enforcement and turning them into animals, and the Israelis owe everyone from George Floyd to the families of fallen, slain police officers, to the owners of businesses, owes them all payments and reparations for, and that's obviously, and that's an even like exaggerated blaming of Israel for like aspects, everything that happened in the aftermath of Floyd was all on Israel. The Israelis should pay everyone from George Floyd's family to business owners of destroyed businesses reparations. It goes from that to cheering on Trump with his fake Bible display and cheering him on as he threatens to send the military into the streets to deal with the domestic terrorist organization, to calling Trump basically saying he betrayed the country by not doing it. And in between all of this, you have promoting a new USS Liberty documentary as well. So it's like firing on all cylinders and playing two different strains of the drum, so to speak.
That's a good point, Greg.
And so, and I think with Wiles, you see this, it becomes a continuum where you see the same talking points are playing. I'll bring up our friend John Swin, Expose the Enemy. He's got some newer infographics linking Rick Wiles and True News to the Family Research Council, which is the organization with Tony Perkins, Jerry Boykin, and Ken Blackwell, as well as to the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney's warmongering, Clash of Civilizations promoting a think tank that's right at the center of bringing in the Muslim Brotherhood and Keith Ellison and Islamic terrorism into the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. Connections there still linking. And so I think if you can understand like the dynamics and the strains of like the differing, seemingly contradictory talking points being pushed out by Rick Wiles, it goes in the direction of very much pushing the buttons, giving red meat to the obvious Israel critics, those who see the and I argue that True News seems to be an operation at this point that's primarily put in place or serving to corral in the Christian evangelicals who are critical of Israel and taking them away from like the John Hagees into the person who's actually being critical of Israel and Zionism, but is basically still pushing pretty much the same talking points outside of that, appealing to those people, but also steering those same people into the direction of, we must declare this group a terrorist organization and treat them like foreign adversaries and throw them in Guantanamo Bay. And so it's a wild hodgepodge mix match of talking points that all seem at the end of the day to coalesce together into seamlessly into the bigger operation that is True News and what Rick Wiles seems to be accomplishing as the anti-Zionist evangelical Christian outlier.
And I would say that like I have noticed that here in the Midwest specifically, there seems like a really strong, authentic Christian leadership towards serious approaches to aspects of justice, including the question of Israel and Palestine, in a way that seems to me that's not easily controlled by either the sort of reactionary, what I would call pseudo-Christian Zionists on the right, nor the more sort of secular, sort of, maybe Marxist-oriented left that likes to control the narrative from their own perspective. And I have sort of just noticed bits of the organizing that seems to sort of transcend some of these lines and these control operations, and especially in relationship to aspects of like certain Christian denominations and communities. For example, like the Mennonite math teacher here in Kansas, I think her name's Esther Coons. She was the one who led the way on basically pushing back the anti-boycott, divestment sanctions, basically seditious law that had been put forth by the Kansas legislature, that she was going to disallow her as a Mennonite woman who had very specific moral and religious commitments that included aspects of boycotting Israel, that she was not going to be able to teach math as paid by any aspect of the sort of Kansas state government unless she signed something that said that she would not do that. And she refused to, and she won, and she pushed it back. Now the states are getting smarter at some level in relationship to the role that the Israeli government, Strategic Ministry of Affairs, AIPAC, as its basically sort of ambassador to the United States, they're getting smarter around the way they're introducing these seditious laws by trying to incorporate it, as they did next door there in Missouri, very recently passed in the Missouri legislature, with opposition, by the way, by a combination of certain progressive political groups, certain libertarians, certain Christian groups, and then also Palestinian, including Muslim leadership. There was some significant opposition that popped up in Missouri, but the Missouri legislature passed an anti-boycott, divestment sanction law that didn't make it about an individual like the Mennonite math teacher Esther Kuntz here in Kansas, but made it more about corporations wouldn't be allowed to do business with the state of Missouri if they were over 100,000. So that sort of solidifies the propaganda and the sort of big, large scale reasoning for anti-boycott, divestment sanctions, which really goes all the way up to thinking about this merger or this takeover by Israeli military intelligence technology into basically all aspects, at the very least, of like American cyber life, American cybersecurity life, the Microsoft Jedi cloud, the Pentagon cloud situation, all of this. All of that stuff, and
30 minutes to an hour, please.
Greg, you're not talking to me.
What's on your mind, my friend? Send a message me and told me. That's cool.
Greg,
all right, I'll talk to you in a little while.
Oh, Greg, are you talking to me? No, you're on the phone, huh?
All right, well.
Greg, were you on the phone?
I had to. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I got distracted. At first I thought you were talking to me, and then I realized you were on the phone. I got distracted about what I was saying. But the Missouri legislature, the anti-BDS stuff is structurally oriented to secure the sort of merger, i.e., Israeli military intelligence takeover of the cyber structure at some level. And of course, the sort of progressive aspect left of the Palestinian solidarity movement wants to keep it focused on small scale cultural stuff, things like boycotts by artists or SodaStream or academics. But meanwhile, this is solidifying this really high level thing that's happening. And so I just wanted to point out what is in the mix right now in relationship to Midwest politics that involve what I would call serious Christians, who are leading the way in many ways in terms of protecting, first of all, the Bill of Rights and the best of the American tradition that obviously includes the First Amendment would protect all, if money is speech in politics, then obviously not giving someone money is also political speech. You can't compelling moneyed speech. That's crazy. By a foreign government? You're crazy. So, a Mennonite math teacher in Kansas leading the way against that, to me, is indicative that there is some serious, really hardcore, what I call American Christian and ecumenical, because it's not just Christian, it's not only religious, although it is sort of spans Christian to Muslim to Jewish too, but also includes secular oriented people too. A resistance to this, all aspects of this, both the problem of, human rights violations of Palestinians over there, but also what's going on in terms of over here and this takeover operation. And so I just wanted to point that out, that in the midst of the sort of controlled fake Zionist Christian right, that in some ways also Zionist and anti-Zionist Christian right. In the case of Rick Wiles, I would say, which sort of fits into its own horseshoe of some sort, in terms of his St. Petersburg moment or whatever, path through St. Petersburg moment, but also the control, sort of more secular, sort of Marxist-oriented left that likes to control the discourse, and that's actually sort of very largely secular, Jewish-dominated in terms of its control mechanism. But that in the middle, maybe I might say this radical middle, both geographically and politically, and maybe even spiritually, we might say, where we seek to go to the root of things, and we also seek to root out spiritual wickedness in high places, that there is something very deep and authentic actually bubbling up that is also has its very strong religious component and a strong Christian component. And so I think that we just want to note that there is that, and that is also cause for some real hope too.
Absolutely. And one thing that I really appreciate about you the most is you do throw a very optimistic message centered around this idea of the radical middle and the things that can actually bring people together rather than just continue this constant push for divisiveness that we're seeing really being pushed more and more at levels that are just seem to be increasing daily in terms of the level of divisiveness and domestically here. And let's find the radical middle. Let's find maybe the best aspects of like the principled conservative based Christianity of someone like our friend John Brisson, and then bring in some of the traditionals and some traditions, some of the more principled, more liberal based aspects of the Christian faith, and as well as other principled outliers, even as well. Don't even have to, even from a more secular perspective. And let's try to find maybe a middle of the road, actual principled opposition to these to the types of policies that get weaponized with the nonsensical BS of Rick. Let's tie in serious, sober-minded analysis of Israeli police training, of Israel training American law enforcement officers with apocalyptic end times, failed predictions, and inflammatory language that just discredits legitimate opposition. Let's try to. There's an example of the radical middle. Let's find a radical middle somewhere in the middle of that actually bridges the fence and does not bring light to these issues, either in the controlled, leftist, anything to the, anything that goes too far in terms of criticism of Zionist policy in America's anti-Semitic, or the Rick Wiles just discredit everything with the false prediction, apocalyptic nonsense, BS, inflammatory language that just makes anybody who questions, who talks about conspiracies or criticizes Israel and just frothing at the mouth religious, extremist, hateful nutcases.
Yeah, and the one last thought I had about this is that the language of the extreme and the extremes is often and I would say that I would understand also to be sort of tied in with the reactionary, and rather than the responsive, right? The responsive is that which sort of responds to a problem or a moment, but does not react. React is sort of like it's sort of almost just pushing away rather than an actually like a committed response that you've actually sort of thought out and committed to. Okay, so but this whole idea of the extreme or the extremes and the reactionary is conflated with the radical, and I think they're completely different. And because the radical is basically is more of a vertically oriented concept of some sort. That's why it's related to radix, to rooting out. So that's always like down, up and down axis rather than a quote left-right axis, which is sort of extremes are usually sort of thought about that as sort of the left and right extreme in many ways. And so that's why I think that, sure, these are just all words and concepts at some level, but I really think the more that we work through and sort of sift and winnow some of these really hardcore swaths of disinformation, we also begin to understand how powerful understanding is, and how powerful real dialogue is, and how powerful discourse is. And so I just think that we need to give possibility to the idea that understanding our situations, which would include our politics all the way to our spiritual, including everything in between, that would include economics, is being subverted and held up and sort of pushed to the extreme, i.e. in a way of the agent provocateur, in ways that if we just reoriented ourselves with a different concept, it really might help us have a better conversation.
Yes, and I think that is about a perfect note to wrap this marathon up here. But Jeremy, it's been a privilege, and it's been fun, particularly to zero in on Steve Pieczenik for the first time. I think we've gotten a lot of important information. I am going to try to, I think, split up at least from where we finished discussing the breaking down this InfoWars stream with Pieczenik and Lee Stranahan. I mean, I think I am going to break apart the portion where I get specifically into like the nature of my dialogue with Stranahan and the conversation that followed that. So I'll probably, once this is uploaded into one big video, I'll probably splice that apart and put that into a separate video for people who might just want to hear like the specifics of what we wanted to discuss regarding Lee Stranahan and also the True News conversation. But it has been a lot of fun doing this with you. And yeah, we need to cover more Steve Pieczenik interviews.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg, for this long, really well-developed conversation, and for playing that piece and really sort of helping us focus on Pieczenik and Stranahan and Jones and the wider world that they all, front for at some level. So
yeah, man, it's been a lot of fun, and yeah, we'll some point here, maybe before the end of the week, probably the next 7 days or so, I think we will try to get out the what we alluded to earlier, talking about going deeper into aspects of what we talked about with China and what Lee Stranahan was getting into with with Lieber, and some deeper dives into aspects interrelated to that and interconnected to other things as well. So that'll, we'll look out for that probably. I want to say we'll probably get that out sometime in the next 7 days. Not sure when, though. I guess when we both have time to do it. So
yeah, maybe over the weekend would be a good time so we can really sort of expand out into it and sort of gather our research a little bit more. But that
all right.
Well, good.
Until next time, folks, we will be back with you soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg. Everybody have a good evening, rest of the evening out there, and I'm going to try to regain my appetite after all of this Alex Jones talk. Okay, I'm going to play the outro music, and then I'll end the live stream. All right, thanks, Greg. Right. Bye-bye. Right. That was the wrong one. Here's the right one.